Flow in Him, without self. Jacobo Grinberg, Education for the New Era. Chapter 1. A Real Experience in Mexico. It's Thursday morning and Mexico City is dawning hazy. I'm preparing for the most exhilarating experience of the week, working with the children of Toluca. The 60 kilometers that separate Mexico City from Toluca are a delight. Forests, lakes, and mountains filled with greenery and freshness. I arrived at the Torres Quintero Institute punctually at 10 a.m. 400 children study here using training methods that allow them to learn to read at 2.5 years of age. Some children have read more than 500 books by the age of 10. The first time I visited this institute, I was invited to talk with the children in a 5th grade class. The children surrounded me inside a round room built into the ground. I introduced myself, and 15 minutes later we discussed the relationships between Dali, the theory of relativity, and postmodernism in Mexican mural painting. I left there thinking it wasn't real, and yet it was. I confess I was worried. Those brilliant kids demonstrated the absence of limits in education, and that was precisely what was worrying. Surely would surpass to their teachers very soon, and new functions would have to appear in their overstimulated brains. Who would guide and where would transiti? Expressed my concern to the institute's directors, and they asked me to collaborate with them. 5 years earlier, I had participated in a development program for children at another Mexican school located in the city of Cuernavaca. I had taught them extraocular vision and an observation method that proved successful, but provoked great rejection from the parent community, who were frightened by the thought that their children would become atypical. The mistake was not having included the parents in the program. This time, the same would not happen. A week later we gathered all the parents and I shared with them the concern about the new roles and the need for their children to learn techniques to become their own guides and teachers, as they would soon surpass all his mentors. They asked me for a more complete explanation. I told them that in conventional education systems, knowledge is imparted from outside, but there is no emphasis or interest in teaching how to learn. If knowledge could be imparted, and the guide and teacher within us all simultaneously activated, the latter would point the right way. They agreed. The work with the children began 15 days later. We chose a pilot group, representative of children between the ages of 9 and 12. For over 2 hours we analyzed what was happening to them together, and I proposed that they work 1 day a week on learning how to learn. The concentration. Learning about oneself means having the ability to observe oneself, and, from that observation, deduce the state in which we operate, and what we need to correct. To be able to observe our inner selves, the fundamental tool is concentration. The work with the children of Toluca was based on the above reasoning. We began the sessions by feeling our bodies, walking through the internally concentrating on breathing. 25 children and I would stand in different places around the room, close our eyes, and feel our arms, the weight of our bodies on our legs, the tension in our backs, and the breathing movements. We played, and we shouted at the top of our lungs, trying to extract tension from our organism, and we observed ourselves again, attentive to any internal change. The children amazed me with their seriousness. They looked attentive and focused, and some expressed their amazement at noticing bodily signals they had never noticed before. One girl told us that by concentrating on her heart, she could see it pumping its own blood. A statement like the one above was enough for the other children to understand that such an observation was possible, and to try it on their own bodies. The observation. Afterwards were relaxed, going to bed face up. During the analysis session, we had already discussed the possibility of changing the observer's location. I had told them about experiences with other children, who were able to change their observation perspective, even placing themselves in out-of-body locations. I had warned them that this wasn't a paranormal or esoteric effect, but rather a function accessible to everyone but not widely known. The adults didn't practice it and had forgotten it could exist. It wasn't even taught in school, but we went to practice it. The children asked me why the school didn't teach the most important thing. I answered, and I had asked myself the same question many times without finding an answer. School was supposed to teach us to know ourselves from within, to observe ourselves, to become our own masters, to develop our full potential. But this rarely happened, and now we were going to try. We continue observing and feeling our bodies, but lying down and relaxed. Observation, to be effective, must be accompanied by an attitude of acceptance. Without acceptance, observation fails to fulfill its purpose, which is to understand reality as it is, both in our bodies and internal processes, as well as in our environment. It is accepted in order to obtain reliable and truthful information. It is accepted in order to achieve self-knowledge, and this is modified. Therefore, if you want to transform something, you must first accept and love it as it is. I asked the children to try to observe their entire bodies as a whole. They did so effortlessly. Then I asked them to try to see themselves as they were, lying down and wearing the clothes they were wearing. The signal that they had succeeded was to raise their hand. 15 little arms were raised at first, and then all the other children began to observe themselves from outside. I asked them to look around the room with their eyes closed and to locate a window. Then they approached her and left the room. The children began to float, like observers, above the school. Some of them described the scene. So-and-so is playing with so-and-so. The school looks really strange from up there. I asked them to go even higher. They described the city of Toluca to me from the clouds. More. The blue sky and the pillowy clouds below. More. The sky darkens and stars begin to appear. You can see the beautiful planet floating in. A black starry sky. You can see blue and white and green, and the children are in space. And I am amazed that it was so easy. I made them come back little by little. As they passed through the clouds, they got wet, and as they entered the room through a window, they got in each other's way. The analysis. The experience was analyzed afterward. Some children doubted they had actually traveled. Others were sure they had. They all agreed it was delightful, and they had also seen the entire Earth from the outside and realized it was our home and that it floats in the middle of space. They made me promise that next Thursday I would take them even further. Some wanted to visit Mars, and others some distant galaxy. First, the experience, and then the correlation with what had already been written. The children had seen Earth, and on the next occasion, they visited Mars and Andromeda. Now they were eager to see if the astronomy books described what they had experienced. They were eager and curious, truly interested, and no one had to force them to study. Rather, they demanded more information from their teachers. Direct knowledge. The Hindus call it samyama, and the technique is described in Patanjali's yoga aphorisms. If you want to know a flower, become the flower, and you will know it from within. I explained the method to the children. It consisted of deciding what they wanted to know: a flower, water, clouds, one of their internal organs, insects. Then applying concentration to it, observing it with the utmost attention. They had to maintain observation until only the object existed in their consciousness. Little by little, and if they kept observing for a long enough time, they would melt with the object, becoming it. They heard me with wide open eyes and immediately went out into the garden. They returned after 20 minutes. Each one wanted to tell me what they had discovered. They were truly excited. A little girl spoke first. She had decided to get to know a flower. She had observed it intently for several minutes, and then she had gone inside. It was yellow and turned into a yellow flower. The wind swayed it, and suddenly she felt tickly. A bee had landed inside. A boy spoke next. He had decided to get to know water. He approached the small school pond and looked at the placid surface of the liquid. He began to be water, and suddenly he felt dizzy. Someone had thrown a stone into the pond, and the waves had surprised him and made him dizzy. Another boy found an insect. He watched it until he began to feel the beating of a tiny green heart. The most subtle case was another boy who decided to explore space. He sat on a bench and concentrated on the air. then on the ground of the air, and then on what supported the ground of the air. He had unwittingly dabbled in one of the most sophisticated Buddhist meditation techniques. Meditation. The children of Toluca began to talk about samyama quite naturally. They used it to learn about hundreds of objects, and the originality of their descriptions made them delightful to listen to. I decided to teach them meditation techniques. Concentrating on breathing, the body, or various objects, including space, was actually meditation, so I was able to introduce the topic as naturally as possible. I told them that meditation was concentrating on an object, and that the technique was more valuable the more subtle the object of observation. Space was much more subtle than a rock, but the most subtle and most valuable thing was to meditate on oneself, trying to do samyama on the self in order to come to know who we are. I doubted whether they had understood and guided them the first time. We focused on observing our bodies, our breathing, and finally, our inner selves. What words describe the feeling of selfhood and the encounter with the self? There are no descriptions of it, because its existence cannot be reduced to a description. Therefore, the children were not asked to explain themselves. Just looking at their smiling faces was enough to tell that some of them had found themselves. Fly. The same boy who had decided to do samyama about space discovered that this could be a suitable technique for flying. He told his classmates, and from there, a whole aeronautical movement began among the kids. They discovered that it was more difficult than they imagined. First, it wasn't enough to merge with space or make an effort. What's more, making an effort seemed to increase weight rather than decrease it. Then they discovered that the desire to fly prevented levitation. It seemed to be necessary to desire it without desiring it, and to merge without merging. To this day, no one has succeeded, although some say they have already felt a slight attachment. Extraocular vision. What most of these children did achieve was extraocular vision. Before explaining what it consists of, I would like to mention what we learned from the experience of flying, and in general from all the procedures described up to this point, including samyama. We discovered that achieving a wish isn't so important, whether it's becoming a flower, seeing the earth from space, or flying. What matters is the process. The children themselves discovered this. Whenever any of them boasted about having achieved something better than their classmates or simply different, the others criticized them. They told them that if they continued bragging about the results of their attempts, they would miss out on the most fun part, which was precisely the entire process, regardless of success or failure. I believe this is no longer just knowledge, but true wisdom. I introduced extraocular vision after a long discussion about reality and its perception. The last thing I wanted was to introduce extraocular vision as an isolated phenomenon, detached from the rest. Rather, I wanted children to see in it a demonstration of an extreme but normal perceptual act, illustrative of the very foundations of the creation of conscious experience. I based my work on the teachings of the greatest Mexican shamans, who believe that by understanding the way we perceive, we can know everything because we will understand the fundamentals of the creation of reality. Extraocular vision is the ability to see images without using your eyes, but rather some other part of your body, usually the palms of your hands. Extraocular vision training consists of concentrating on the body, breathing, and activating an energy line that connects the palms of the hands to the space between the eyebrows. Children with a good ability to concentrate and under 16 years old learn to see with their hands from the first training session. The more free the child is, that is, less rigid, the faster their learning will be. As I mentioned before, I had already successfully tested the method with the children of Cuernavaca, with whom I discovered that activating extraocular vision stimulated a series of correlated functions. These, in the order in which they appeared, were 1. Extraocular vision with the palms of the hands. 2. Extraocular vision with any other area of the body. 3. Extraocular vision without contact. 4. Intracorporeal vision. 5. Healing. 6. Ability to communicate directly. And 7. various effects of mind-matter interaction. Here's a brief description of the sequence. First, the child learns to see with his hands by touching the graphic material. Then he learns to see with any part of his body, which he then removes from direct contact. The child can see without eyes at a distance, for example. They read a printed page without touching it, or see their surroundings. Their vision of the environment is 360-degree. Later, the child is able to see inside the bodies of their peers or their own, even in the dark. When this happens, a kind of telepathic ability begins to activate, in which the child recognizes the thoughts of their peers or adults. Intracorporeal vision and the ability to communicate directly allow the child to be able to heal. Finally, the child who has gone through all the previous stages begins to be able to affect objects, moving them from their places without touching them. The children of Toluca repeated the previous sequence, but at an astonishing speed, reaching the 7th phase very quickly. When one of these children learned to see extraocularly, their classmates would ask them to demonstrate, and this was enough to activate the function in them. Thus, within a few days, more than 50 children at the institute were able to see extraocularly, and some of them taught others. The masters. We decided from the first session with the children to extend the training to the teachers. I wanted to avoid repeating the failure in Cuernavaca and also ensure the continuity of the techniques. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't provide the training to 400 children alone. So training the teachers would ensure the training was extended to everyone. The same sessions as those given to the children were given to the school teachers, but the results were very poor in terms of the mentor's mastery, but very satisfactory, as they accepted the methodology and considered it a formal part of the curriculum. Currently, the Torres Quintero Institute in Toluca is the first educational institution in Mexico to incorporate these self-awareness techniques into its curriculum. I hope this model will spread to other schools and, in the future, to the entire Mexican educational system. Chapter 2: In Search of the Light, an encounter with Mayan shamanism. It's hot in Rishikesh. So much so that the only way to avoid overheating is to dive into the icy, refreshing Ganges. In a small bookstore adjacent to the river, I found a treasure, an original text describing an ancient meditation technique, Mahamudra. I was fascinated to read it. It asserts that all experience arises from the same source, and that this can be understood by observing the origin of every thought, every image or sound. I practiced it sitting on the sand, watching the tiny waves form on the riverbank. Later, while walking through the city market, I tried to focus my attention on the origin of the commands that activate my steps. Later, when I got angry at a shop assistant who tried to deceive me, the text is right. If we look at the origin of every experience, we establish contact with a kind of mirror of reality that is unaffected by the modifications of experience, and that only reflects its foundations, its basic, self-effulgent luminosity. Soon, I began to encounter obstacles and needed a guide, a teacher. I was in India, and Mahamudra is a Buddhist technique. The gurus didn't know it. I decided to look in Nepal, and at a monastery near Kathmandu, Lama Lundrup answered me with a laconic, "What are you doing here?" Mahamudra is you, when I ask him for a lama who would guide me in my practice. I return to Rishikesh and meditate beside Sivananda's tomb in the Divine Life Society temple. I observe myself and maintain this observation until I recognize my center and integrate into myself. The environment is clear and serene, and the sunlight penetrates through the main door of the temple, warming the atmosphere. I step outside, and a dark-skinned, robust girl catches my eye. Something about her energy is familiar. I approach her, and when she confesses her Jewish origin, I confirm my impression. I am Jewish too. I notice some scars on her arms. She tells me that before India, she lived in Cancun, dedicated to hunting crocodiles and learning about herself with the help of her teacher, Don Panchito de Tixhualactun, a 130-year-old Mayan shaman. I recognize a sign in the encounter and know that my next destination will be the Yucatan Peninsula. The only way to reach Don Panchito is through Dona Sara, his main disciple. I meet Dona Sara in Cancun, and she subjects me to a dozen tests and an intense interrogation before agreeing to introduce me to her teacher. She wants to be sure of the goodness of my intentions and the quality of my energy. She finally agrees, and in the early hours of the morning, she sends a message to Don Panchito through a vigil. She lights a candle, focuses on it, and sends her thought, Jacobo, and will arrive tomorrow at 2 a.m. The road to Tixualactun is magical. We pass through a kind of vegetal tunnel, tinged with a penetrating energy, that leads to a small town typical of the central region of the Yucatan Peninsula. Several women dressed in flowers collect water from a deep cenote, and a centuries-old church rests in the calm of a warm, placid atmosphere. I feel as though I'm in another world. And Doña Sara points me toward a hut with a thatched roof and stick walls. Don Panchito lives here, she whispers. The interior of the hut is occupied by a hammock hanging from the ceiling. Doña Sara tells me to lie down in it, and I feel the invitation as a preamble to an initiation ceremony. Don Panchito doesn't appear, and I obey Doña Sara. Several minutes pass, and a red reflection catches my eye. I turn toward him, and a thin old man holding a cane appears in the doorway. His eyes are like two torches, and his face reflects great strength. I feel his energy in my heart, and a kind of sparkling bridge forms between us. I approach him, and he hugs me, sniffing first the left side of my face and then the right. I laugh, delighted by the originality of the greeting. Don Panchito says something in Mayan, which Dona Sara translates for me. He says your energy is very similar to his, and that he expected us at 2 in the morning, and we arrived at 3 in the afternoon. I'm amazed. The veiling is an exacting yet mysterious technique. Don Panchito invites me to lie in his hammock, while he occupies another one he hangs from the ceiling. We fall silent, and little by little, my mind seems to be tinged with Don Panchito's. I pay close attention and achieve an astonishing lucidity I've never experienced before. I'm sure something about Don Panchito has been transferred to me and infected me. Suddenly, a dog barks, but the sound doesn't come from outside or in the distance, but from a part of my mind. I'm able to follow, step by step, the creation of the bark, to witness its origin in a kind of unaffected, self-reflecting mirror, and to follow its path in my consciousness, from level to level, until it disappears like the waves of a turbulent sea that has suddenly regained calm. I remember Aurobindo's description: thoughts are like birds that cross a clear sky without leaving a trace. I turn to look at Don Panchito, and I realize that my search for a Mahamudra master has been rewarded. For Don Panchito, everything happens inside the mind. There is no interior or exterior, but a continuum, without space or time, in which events appear. Don Panchito invites me to visit him again and stay with him for several days. As I say goodbye, Don Panchito sniffs at me, and Doña Sara translates his farewell message. He says not to worry, he will take care of you and continue teaching you while you sleep. The return. I'm lying in a hammock inside Don Panchito's hut with him beside me, also lying in a hammock. I don't understand Mayan, and Don Panchito doesn't seem to understand Spanish. From time to time he says something to me and I respond with a questioning murmur. Communication, however, exists between us, but on a level that transcends the verbal. We've been like this for several days. My mind, as during the first visit, seems to be one with Don Panchito's and the surroundings. I've grown accustomed to the lack of separation between the internal and the external, and I continue to perceive the creation of my own experience from a vantage point that allows me to witness the origin of my perceptions, their changes, and their interaction processes. My thoughts form a kind of mesh or interconnecting fabric. I can see the emergence of each one, but the strangest thing is not being able to live like this forever. Perhaps the city itself is to blame, with its noise and distractions. Here, in this silence interrupted only by the chirping of birds or the barking of dogs, anything seems possible. Don Panchito gets up very early, before sunrise. He sits in his hammock, meditative, contemplating the sunrise. His cat sits at his feet, and the image of this centenarian man, his head covered with a cap, and his cat resting beneath him, his hammock, the hut, and the Mayan atmosphere, form a picture of such beauty and meaning that they make me feel fulfilled and blessed. At night, the whitish moonlight penetrates through the gaps in the walls, and Don Panchito teaches me, in my sleep, how to travel through universes. From Mexico City, I wasn't able to detect it, but here I don't have to make any effort for it to happen. The universes I see are varied and very strange. Sometimes stars appear, other times mountainous landscapes, and occasionally underwater. The most important thing is knowledge and observation of mental and cerebral processes. We possess an extraordinary instrument inside our heads, and it's a shame not to know how to use it or see it. I am grateful to Don Panchito for this magnificent gift he has given me, and I wish I could do the same for everyone. The patients. From time to time, they come to consult Don Panchito. They complain to him and listen to his advice. Difficult cases require the guidance of the stars. At night, Don Panchito goes out into the garden, sits on a bench, and remains absorbed in contemplating the sky. The next morning, depending on the content of his dreams, he offers advice or shares his clairvoyance with his patients. The stars and their dreams seem to be the advisors of this shaman, who is 90 years older than me. On other occasions, Don Panchito takes a crystal sphere out of a bag, lights a candle, places it in front of the flame, and concentrates on observing the interior of the sphere. He says the images that appear tell him what he should do with his patients and speak to him of their destinies. Don Panchito says nothing about the future. The first time I saw him work with his spheres, I asked him to see me through them and tell me what would happen. He was shocked when I tried to record his words. That can't be done. Don't you realize that doing so would fix the future? Quartz crystals. The Mayans knew about quartz crystals and their use hundreds of years before the West discovered gem therapy. Don Panchito keeps several, but he is very careful with them. He says they amplify everything, good and evil, and that they must be nurtured so they don't lose their power and energy. Only a trained shaman can do that. It's a shame I don't understand Mayan. I take advantage of a visit from Dona Sara to ask questions about quartz. Don Panchito says the ancient Mayan priests possessed secrets. They were able to build their monuments by moving stones from a distance, using their minds and the sounds they made. They whistled, and depending on the tonal sequence and the sharpness of their sounds, they were able to control matter and energy. The high priests met around large tables made entirely of crystals. Each priest imbued a crystal with his energy so that, in the event of his death, it would replace him in his work, while another initiate was trained. The work on the quartz table served to achieve a proper balance of cosmic influences. Mayan acupuncture. In the same town of Don Panchito, and in the rest of the peninsula, live shamans dedicated to healing and maintaining their tradition, although none seems to have reached Don Panchito's level of consciousness. Acupuncture is practiced among Mayan shamans. They use rattlesnake fangs or fox hairs as needles. Through its use, they extract the damage that patients have acquired. The Mayan acupuncturist locates the affected area of the body and then inserts his or her needles into it. For nerve conditions, the chosen area is the skull. For kidney conditions, the areas of the back adjacent to these organs, etc. The use of acupuncture seems to come from a remote past, and its use is widespread. The use of fire. Don Rakpek from the city of Motul is a Mayan shaman, a specialist in the use of fire. When a patient asks for help, Don Rakpek lights a container filled with paraffin, and listens to the shapes of the flames emerging from the fuel, while palpating the patient with the help of a branch of rue. The shape of the fire speaks to him, indicating the diagnosis and the herbs he should use to cure his patients. Don Panchito knows all these techniques, but in his opinion, they are unnecessary. His message is that the higher the level of a shaman, the less need there is for him to rely on instruments. The heart. Don Panchito's message is one of love, tenderness, and affection. His path is the heart and simplicity. He neither boasts of his knowledge, nor boasts of his power, nor seeks honor. His life is modest, clean, and unpretentious. He almost always remains alone in contemplation and a meditative attitude. Doña Sara found him when, looking at the surface of the water in a cenote, his face appeared to her, and she received a message stating that the features she saw were those of her teacher, whom she should seek out. For months she dedicated herself to doing so until her heart led her to Tixhualactun. Something similar happened to me. When I was searching for an Indian teacher, my heart led me to that girl who told me about Don Panchito. However, Don Panchito's teaching is that each person is their own teacher, and all wisdom lies within each person. The rivals, unfortunately, Don Panchito's kindness and detachment, are not shared by some powerful people living on the Yucatan Peninsula. In Tixhualactun itself, 3 sorcerers live who envy Don Panchito and have tried to take his power away. Don Panchito laughs at such motivations and is unconcerned, but he takes care of his disciples by assigning them protectors. This theme is tinged with mystery and portents. A protector is an entity, a life force, or a psychic resultant that the shaman is able to create or invoke through a special ceremony. Don Panchito has assigned 3 protectors to Doña Sara, whose mission is to defend her from any attempt to harm her. The protected person bears a great responsibility in accepting such an assignment, because his protectors have no qualms about causing terrible harm to anyone who dares to defy them. On one occasion, Doña Sara became careless and allowed 3 individuals to steal her money. 3 weeks later, one of the thieves was found dead in her home, another committed suicide, and the third was left disabled. Don Panchito was enraged by his disciples' irresponsibility and threatened to take away her protectors if she became careless again. Los Aluches. The subject of power and its use is treated with great discretion among Mayan shamans. The ancient Mayan feats of power, including their prodigious capacity for mind-matter interaction, clairvoyance, understanding, and invocation of protectors, are shared only with their chosen disciples. The Alushes are one of these themes of power. The shaman is able to embody his power in small clay statues. These Alushes are used to defend homes, crops, or workplaces from energy disturbances, theft, or attempts at destruction. Traveling with Doña Sara, I had the opportunity to experience the power of an Aluche in a small town near the coast. It was a 25-centimeter tall doll that threw me backward when I touched it. Direct communication. One of the characteristics common to every true shaman, regardless of their geographical location, place of origin, or lineage, is their ability to establish and maintain direct communication with their disciples, patients, and protégés. I already mentioned one of these instances in the veiling process. In it, Doña Sara decodes the movements of a candle flame to understand the messages coming from Don Panchito, although the latter does not need to use any instrument other than his own mind to communicate. This capacity for direct communication is a consequence of Don Panchito's state of oneness and Mahamudra. The feeling when you are with this great shaman is that, somehow, he knows who you are, what you are thinking, and what your intentions are, but above all how far you are from your center, essence, or source. The center in being. The true shaman can diagnose and know how far someone is from their true center, because they have managed to situate themselves there. The difficulty in describing the meaning and experience of being in the center is immense, because this state transcends any verbal description. The shaman recognizes the distance between an individual's consciousness and his own, and has the power to guide him or her to that distance. This is the true shamanic feat, beyond energetic manipulations or clairvoyance. Recalling the center or stimulating its experience constitutes the greatest miracle of the shamanic tradition in general, and of the Mayan tradition in particular. Chapter 3. The Levels of Consciousness, Part 1. An analysis of models of consciousness. The term consciousness refers to that which lies at the foundation of all experience. The levels of consciousness are the strata into which this foundation can be divided. In reality, consciousness is one and undivided, because all experience is colored by it. For example, auditory and visual consciousness constitute two levels of the same basic quality. We call this essential quality consciousness, and it is possible to postulate that even what we call matter possesses, or is based on the same foundation, at least at the perceptual level. There are schools of thought regarding the different levels of consciousness, each with a particular conception. However, they all agree on the existence of basic strata, such as those mentioned above: auditory, visual, tactile, etc. consciousness, and more subtle levels that each tradition names differently. In 2 chapters, I will attempt to describe 6 of these traditions, mentioning some of their considerations and the postulates that support them. I will first present the model proposed by Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, then the theosophical model, later the shamanic model, then the Buddhist model, the transpersonal psychology model, and finally the synergic model. I dare to postulate that what they all have in common is the consideration that the strata of consciousness depend on the perception of the observer, and this on the territory with which the latter identifies. The Kabbalistic model. According to Gershom G. Scholem on the Kabbalah and its symbolism. Schocken Books. New York, 1969 to 1973. In none of their systems have the Kabbalists failed to affirm the existence of interpolations between all the worlds and levels of being. Everything, according to them, is connected to everything else. From any point, infinite depths can be contemplated. According to the system of Moses Cordovero, man's ascent to higher worlds and to the border of the void does not involve movement on his part, since wherever you are, there are all the worlds. According to Kabbalah, what is below is above and what is within is without. Kabbalah affirms that not only is the whole contained in each part, but it also acts on the rest. The model postulated by Kabbalah is simultaneously longitudinal and concentric. The longitudinal approach attempts to solve the mystery of creation from a transcendent and invisible beginning to its manifestation in action. This model has at least 6 levels, which are equal to 6 worlds or universes. Each universe belongs to a distinct dimension. At the same time, each universe is associated with a level of the soul and with a Hebrew letter. The universe of Adam Kadmon is that of the primordial or archetypal man. Adam Kadmon represents the human being at its origin or highest level of abstraction. It is not, in reality, the first transcendent level, but rather an extraordinarily elevated manifestation of it. Above Adam Kadmon, Kabbalah places the Ein Sof, which translates as the endless, intimately linked to God. The soul level associated with Adam Kadmon is Yekedah, which literally translates as singularity and constitutes the unique essence, that which cannot be divided and is one. Just as Adam Kadmon comes from Ein Sof, so does Atzilut, which is closest to the archetypal man and is associated with the soul level of Chai, the living essence or the living. In Judaism, the name of God Jehovah is written with 4 letters, the first of which, Yud, corresponds to the Latin Un and belongs to the universe of Atzilut or emanation, and to the level of the soul Jai or the living. From Atzilut arises the creation or the universe of Beriah, associated with the level of Neshama or Pneuma, and with the next letter of the name of God, He, which corresponds to the Latin letter H or J. In this way, the singularity of Yekida, which in turn transforms into the living or Jai, flows into Neshama or Pneuma. Before Neshama, the levels of the soul were impersonal. Neshama, associated with the universe of Beriah or creation, begins to belong to a specific individual and is, so to speak, their most subtle sheath or body, their interface between the personal and the transpersonal, between the divine and the human. From Beriah emerges Yetzirah, formation, that is, what was created in Beriah begins to take form in Yetzirah. This formation would seem to correspond to the first activation of a distortion of space, and the corresponding letter of God's name is Vav, or Latin. Fifth, the corresponding level of the soul is Ruach, or spirit, and it could be thought to be the mechanism that, when acting, distorts space. Before Ruach, there are no distortions. Finally, after formation, action takes place in the universe of Asiya, which corresponds to the last letter of God's name, Hey, and to the Nefesh or soul level. The four letters of the name of God, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, form the Tetragrammaton and are a true algorithmic system, one which contains the scheme of creation from the living to its manifestation in action. Each level of consciousness is given by the identification of the observer with any of the 5 possible strata of the soul, from Nefesh, or individual soul, to Yekida, the primordial singularity. 1. An algorithm is a pattern or formula that contains and concentrates information in its structure. This Kabbalistic model is longitudinal, because each level of it comes from or is born from a precedent and gives rise to a consequent, in a chain that begins in a singularity, which acquires life, pneuma, spirit, and finally soul. The concentric pattern of Kabbalah is known as the scheme of the Sephirot, and 10 of them have been described, forming the tree of life. Each Sephirah is an attribute or quality of consciousness, and constitutes an emanation from the Ein Sof. The longitudinal model is intertwined within the concentric model, because each Sephirah manifests through a process of emanation, creation, formation, and action. This process can be experienced using Kabbalistic meditation techniques. For example, Rabbi Joseph Tzayak devised a color meditation in which sustained concentration on a specific color associated with a Sephirah activates that Sephirah's quality of consciousness. Another technique consists of concentrating on the Hebrew name of the Sephirah, or its attributes, until these attributes begin to be experienced. Some Kabbalists have associated the different Sephirot with the parts of the human body. The following table too contains the Hebrew name of each Sephirah, its translation and associated color. 2. Taken from Meditation and Kabbalah, Aryeh Kaplan, S. Weiser, 1982. Sephirah color. Corona white. Jojma Sabiduria, a color that includes all colors. Bina understanding yellow and green. Jesed love white and silver. Gevura strength red and gold. Tiferet beauty yellow and purple. Netzach Victoria light pink. Hod Esplendor dark pink. Yesod foundation orange. Malshut kingdom blue. The extremes of the Sephirot, Keter and Malkut, refer to 2 equally extreme levels of consciousness, Keter being the highest and Malkut its manifestation. The pattern of the Sephirot is concentric, because each Sephirot is contained within the next, like the layers of an onion. However, it is also longitudinal, in the sense that there are linear connections between each layer. Furthermore, each universe, from Absolute to Asiya, can be divided into 10 strata corresponding to the Sephirot of that universe. Kabbalah considers the existence of a luminous center connected to the Ein Sof, whose light illuminates every Sephirah in every universe. The degree of obstruction between their consciousness and the light depends on the individual's internal purity. The less internal filth there is, the greater the luminosity that reaches them, and vice versa. An individual with intense internal problems will act as if they possess veils that obstruct the light. In this conception, Each sephira is an emanation of the light of the Ein Sof. Most, if not all, of the practical techniques of Kabbalah aim to purify the veils so that the light encounters no obstructions. In turn, each sephira acts as a kind of vessel or container for an attribute of the light originating from the Ein Sof. Each of these vessels, when filled with the light, activates an attribute or quality of consciousness. According to Kabbalah, the light never disappears, but obstructive veils can filter it so much that its luminosity may not be sufficient to fill a vessel. The theosophical model. Theosophy has its contemporary origin in the writings of Madame Blavatsky, who founded this school of thought, which was enriched by the studies of Annie Besant and Leadbeater among others. 3. The Secret Doctrine, Theosophical v. Press, Pasadena, California, 1888. According to Theosophy, we possess different bodies, each of which is associated with a level of consciousness. These bodies are 7 in number. 1. The physicist. 2. The etheric. 3. The astral. 4. The mental. 5. The spiritual. 6. The cosmic. And 7. The nirvanic. According to Rajneesh Psychology of the Esoteric, Cuatro Vientos Editorial, Chile 1980, not only is consciousness different in each of the bodies, but also the quality and content of dreams. Consciousness will vary depending on the observer's identification with one or another of the bodies. It is important to mention that the term body refers to an organization or structure belonging to a certain dimension of space. The existence of 7 bodies would also imply the existence of 7 dimensions. An experimental procedure that exemplifies the existence of structures belonging to different dimensions is cymatics. Jenny H., 1974, Cymatics, Basileus Press, Basel. In it, 3-dimensional patterns are created when a fine powder placed on a metal plate is vibrated by a sound of a certain frequency. When the sound frequency is increased sufficiently, the pattern becomes 3-dimensional. We thus have here 2-dimensional bodies resulting from the interaction at different frequencies between a vibrational field and a medium, one 2-dimensional body and the other 3-dimensional. Theosophical bodies would seem to be situated in this same position, being stable structures located in different dimensions. The Sephirot, the Kabbalistic universes and the levels of the soul could be understood in the same way. The first body is the physical body, and its structure is organic. Its organ of thought and experience is the brain, as we know it. It is limited by time and space, and is a hyper-complex and stable distortion of space. Its level of consciousness is 3-dimensional. The second body, the etheric, is, according to Theosophy, more subtle than the physical body and remains invisible to it. It is capable of traveling through space, so to speak, outside the physical body, and its perception is more direct and subtle than the latter's, since it does not require organic receptors to decode information from space. The perceptual action of the etheric body could explain extraocular vision, in which trained children are able to perceive the visual world without the use of their retinal receptors. The dreams of the physical body are causally related to brain activity and can be stimulated by activating the organic receptor mechanisms. In contrast, dreams of the etheric body correspond to etheric stimuli located in the structure of space. Thus, someone can dream of flying and actually do so, because the movements of the etheric body are not bound or restricted by spatial gravitation. According to Rajneesh Psychology of the Esoteric Cuatro Vientos Editorial, Chile, 1980, the so-called spiritual visions correspond to the etheric body and are etheric dreams. The etheric body includes space within its field of action, that is, it is freed from spatial restrictions and space ceases to be an obstacle to its action. Therefore, the spatial dimension in which the etheric body operates is incorporated within it, while that same dimension remains external to the physical body. The astral body incorporates not only space but also time. Like the etheric body, the astral body can locate itself in any region of space. but it has no limits when it comes to traveling to the past, even the remote past. The astral body, according to Rajneesh, is capable of remembering previous lives and corresponds to Jung's collective unconscious. The mental body incorporates, in addition to the temporal dimension of the past, personal future time. It is located, so to speak, in a dimension where time and space are unified. The functioning of the mental body implies an expansion of the duration of the present, in which the past and future are included within a perceptual unity. This same expansion is related to sensory activation, in which visual perception, for example, functions within a longer duration of the present than auditory perception. The functioning of the astral body involves the same expansion, but on a much greater scale. The mental body remains an individual body. The spiritual body, on the other hand, is transpersonal. The experiences of the spiritual body are shared by all who inhabit it. It is a body of the species, not of a particular individual. The cosmic body is the preamble to unity consciousness. This body transcends space, time, individuality, and the dichotomy of conscious or unconscious. From the perspective of the cosmic body, everything possesses consciousness. The nirvanic body cannot be described, for language no longer exists within it. It is equivalent to the consciousness of unity. Chapter 4. The Levels of Consciousness, Part 2. An analysis of models of consciousness. In the previous chapter, I analyzed two different models that attempt to describe and explain the different levels of consciousness. The model proposed by Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and the Theosophical model. In this second part, I will present an analysis of 4 other models about the levels of consciousness. What all these approaches to the study of the levels of consciousness have in common is that they depend on the perception of the observer, and the observer depends on the territory with which it identifies. In reality, consciousness is one and is not divided, because every experience is nuanced by it. However, the same quality of consciousness, awareness, experience, and perception are presented as being made up of different behaviors. Each school that attempts to analyze these behaviors or levels has a particular view of them. The shamanic model. The shamanic model is bifactorial, that is, it considers the existence of 2 general levels of consciousness. Some shamans call these 2 realms the visible world and the invisible world. See Grinberg J., The Shamans of Mexico, Vol. 1, Alpa Corral, Mexico, 1987. Other shamans call them the tonal and the nahual. See Carlos Castaneda, The Inner Fire, Emeche, Mexico, 1987. The visible world is equivalent to the tonal world and refers to the level of everyday consciousness. In contrast, the invisible world, or nahual, refers to a level of consciousness only accessible to the sighted. The Ogiruamas shamans of the Sierra Tarahumara speak of the coexistence of 3 spirits in each person, thereby denoting the presence of at least 3 levels of consciousness. For the graniceros of the state of Morelos, Mexico, the invisible world is populated by astral beings who defy gravity and travel through space, performing healing tasks. Shamans can access this subtle realm, acquiring another level of consciousness through this contact. Some Mexican shamans are capable of penetrating mediumistic trance states, changing not only their usual personality, but also manifesting knowledge that does not belong to the level of everyday waking consciousness. The lineage of the shaman Nahal, Don Juan Matus of Sonora, has developed an entire model of consciousness and its levels. In this model, perception arises as a result of the alignment of 2 emanation systems, one external to the body, and the other internal. The body referred to in this model is not the organic body, but rather a luminous energetic body visible to a seer. The alignment of emanations is modulated through the action of a localization mechanism, which Yaqui shamans call the assemblage point. This is located on the surface of the luminous body, or cocoon, and, depending on its position within it, aligns different bands of emanations, giving rise to perceptions of alternative realities. The levels of consciousness depend on the depth at which the assemblage point is situated. One of the common characteristics of all authentic shamans is their ability to communicate directly, which allows them to understand, without the use of verbal instruments, the state of consciousness of those who visit them. One could postulate the existence of a level of shamanic consciousness that I have called the shamanic band, C. Grinberg, J. The Shamans of Mexico, INPEC, Mexico. The shamanic model is complex and varies from lineage to lineage, although common characteristics such as those mentioned above can be seen in all of them, and in particular, the existence of a generalized mode of shamanic consciousness. The Buddhist model. The Buddhist model is also two-factorial, as exemplified in the life of its creator. Approximately 2,500 years ago, the man we know as Buddha was born the son of a king. He spent his childhood in isolation within his father's palace, surrounded by every comfort. He never knew sickness, old age, or poverty. One day he decided to leave the imperial gardens, and for the first time had contact with the people. Astonished and pained, he realized the existence of disability and sorrow. He abandoned his aristocratic life, and for years underwent numerous teachings in an effort to achieve his own enlightenment. Despairing that neither asceticism, nor religious practices, nor self-control techniques helped him, he sat under a tree to meditate, resolved to die or become enlightened. After several days, upon seeing a star, he achieved what he desired. From that moment on, he dedicated himself to teaching, continuing to do so until the end of his days. His mind was pristinely clear, and through hundreds of discourses given to thousands of disciples, he managed to create an entire movement of spiritual regeneration, which still inspires and guides millions of people. Buddha was a true master, and as such, he taught each person according to their needs and level of understanding. His most advanced students created their own schools and lineages, striving to preserve the original teachings intact and without deviation. However, since Buddha taught each disciple an individualized method, these schools differ from one another, although they all maintain the same direction. For example, there are at least 3 schools of Vipassana. All use observation as a development technique, but each in different areas and content. Observation of bodily sensations, observation of emotions and thoughts, observation of the environment. All 3 claim to be the custodians of Buddha's original teaching and consider the others to be distant from it, when in reality they all represent the original teaching. The two-factor nature of the Buddhist model is the same as that of Buddha. His 2 states of consciousness are everyday consciousness, prior to enlightenment, and enlightened consciousness. The level of everyday consciousness is one in which there is identification with emotional, bodily, or mental fluctuations. The level of enlightened consciousness transcends fluctuating and temporal identifications, and places the adept in a state of contact with the reality of the pure self. In this state, pleasure and pain are seen from the same perspective, and there are no attachments or mental suffering. The enlightened human being is liberated and achieves his true identity as reality itself and all. Buddha described a great number of states of consciousness, and his analyses of mental conditions and their vicissitudes have not been surpassed. Today, there are many different schools of Buddhism, each using a wide range of meditation techniques, but all of them can be classified into 3 main schools: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Hinayana considers that enlightenment is individual and depends on personal work in isolation and solitude. Mahayana also considers that enlightenment is individual, but it cannot be achieved unless everyone achieves it. Mahayamic Buddhism helps others achieve enlightenment, even if it means postponing their own. Their approach is more congruent with unity consciousness and the development of universal love and understanding. Vajrayana uses the energy of emotions as a vehicle to achieve enlightenment. One of Buddha's main discourses, the Mahasatipatthana, exemplifies this enlightened one's method. In it, Buddha admonishes his disciples to maintain detached observation of their bodily sensations, emotions, mental contents, and feelings, subtextually pointing out that any identification with these sensations does not liberate, but that witnessing them from the position of the observer leads to enlightenment. In Sistram Surangama 1, there is another indication along the same lines. Here, the existence of different strata or levels of consciousness is mentioned. Each level is experienced as the ego of the preceding level, and becomes the content of the subsequent level when the latter is reached. In this model, the fundamental consideration is the non-existence of an absolute ego state, and the idea that what makes us advance from level to level of consciousness is the inclusion of the contents of experience within a process of inclusive observation. On the other hand, one of the most beloved concepts of Buddhism is that of sunyata, or emptiness. Sunyata refers to the idea that neither objects nor the self possess absolute independent existence. Rather, everything is part of an interdependent matrix of relationships. The model of transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology incorporates teachings from the Hindu, Buddhist, Theosophical, and Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mysticism traditions into its doctrinal framework. It is called transpersonal because it is interested in development beyond a personal ego, and its field of study includes transcendent states of consciousness. According to transpersonal psychology, the most natural and highest level of consciousness is that of unity consciousness, in which the differences between object and subject, observer and observed, dissolve into a single, all-encompassing reality. Consciousness exists in everything, but human beings fragment and limit it by assigning boundaries of separation. These boundaries are determined by limiting identifications. The most common of all identities is the one associated with the ego ideal. When a child is educated, both their parents and their school pressure them to accept the set of cultural values considered positive and reject others classified as negative. The appearance of negative behaviors is punished, and the manifestation of positive thoughts, ideas, and actions is rewarded. Little by little, the child identifies with the positive aspects and represses the negative ones. If a society considers certain bodily needs to be negative, it teaches us to block them even when they manifest naturally. This establishes the first boundary of consciousness. When negative aspects cross this boundary, the individual is responsible for denying them as part of their real identity, only accepting the positive as valid and true. Thus, a personality or mask and a shadow are created. The mask is what is accepted, and the shadow is what is rejected. When the shadow is activated, the subject blames the outside world or others for its appearance. In the most severe cases, the shadow manifests as hallucinations or delusions of persecution. The subject, unable to accept the negative aspects as part of their true identity, projects them onto others, thus safeguarding their identity with the positive aspects. When the tension between the personality and the shadow becomes insurmountable, an identity crisis occurs, which either becomes somatized, causing illness and, in its extreme, death, or activates a process of incorporation of the shadow into the mask. When this last happens, and the subject manages to accept as part of themselves the negative aspects they previously rejected and projected, a shift in consciousness occurs. In this shift, the subject acquires an ego, which integrates the positive and negative aspects into a unity. This new identification incorporates the body and its needs as parts of the real identity. A boundary of separation dissolves, and consciousness expands. However, at this level of consciousness, which Ken Wilber calls the centaur, and which already includes the body and the shadow, a boundary still exists between self and other, or between subject and object. To access a new level of consciousness, the notion of the body must undergo an expansion. In this expansion, events, experiences, and patterns that were previously considered external, that is, to the non-self, are incorporated into the self. In this way, the centaur begins to identify with his territory, and a rapprochement toward unity with others occurs. Others and oneself are no longer separate, but are experienced as united in a new identity. Later, the subject recognizes himself as a true son of man. That is, his consciousness is no longer that of an independent and separate person, but human in the highest sense of the word. All human emotions, all feelings and experiences that are capable of being lived as a human being, are accepted as part of his identity. It is no longer so-and-so who experiences, but the human being in so-and-so who manifests. This identification with the human is a more expanded level of consciousness than the centaur consciousness, but it is still limited and has boundaries of separation. The next level of consciousness could be called cosmic, when the Son of Man incorporates the cosmos as part of his real identity. Finally, cosmic man becomes the being or pure existence, and partial denominations and identities cease to exist. Thus, the consciousness of unity and the Tao are attained. All levels of consciousness are associated with layers of identification and increasingly blurred boundaries, until the final division breaks down and one experiences that which has no name as the true. At this level, one understands that any image or percept sees itself, and that what one experiences is that located within oneself, and finally, that and oneself merge into the one, the synergic model. Before presenting this model, it is necessary to explain several technical terms that I will use in its presentation. First of all, the term lattice. Contemporary physics considers space to have different levels of organization. The most basic level is conceived as a very complex matrix, a lattice or trellis whose structure is capable of containing an enormous amount of information. This fundamental structure is called the lattice. According to lattice physics, each elementary particle is a specific modification in the conformation of the lattice. Similarly, an energy field could be understood as a distortion of the structure of the lattice itself. The second term I would like to explain is neural field. The human brain is made up of 12 billion tiny cells called neurons. Each neuron, when activated, produces a tiny change in electrical potential, activates a code of electrical signals, and stimulates the creation of an electromagnetic field. Each of these modifications to the state of neurons is a change in the structure of the lattice. All of these distortions, in turn, interact with each other and create a hypercomplex modification of the lattice itself. This modification is called the neural field. Synergistic theory states that reality is the interaction between the lattice and the neural field, and that the different levels of reality are related to the characteristics of this interaction. Another term that requires explanation is synergy. Synergy is a neologism that combines the terms synthesis and energy. It refers to three physical parameters: coherence, information density, and frequency. The higher these parameters, the higher the synergy. Coherence refers to the similarity in the organization of the parts of a whole. The greater the coherence of an organization, the more similar its parts will be. Informational density refers to the amount of information any object or medium can contain. Frequency refers to the speed at which a body or energy field oscillates. Thus, the greater the synergy, the greater the coherence, informational density, and frequency. The greatest desire of every thinker is to arrive at a conception of reality that allows us to accept its infinite diversity, but at the same time places us within the perspective of a unifying vision of it. The synergic model aims to achieve this ambitious goal through the conceptualization of a scheme that explains the creation of perception. According to the synergic model, consciousness is an attribute of the lattice of space-time, whose fundamental or basic state also constitutes the primordial state of consciousness, which could well be called pure consciousness. The different levels of consciousness are so many strata of distortions that the basic structure of the lattice can assume. Human consciousness, for example, appears when the human brain manages to create a neural field that establishes a hypercomplex macro distortion in the lattice. From this perspective, a visual image, for example, is itself a particular three-dimensional distortion of the lattice that requires to be activated, a human brain and a neural field, but does not require an observer to exist. For this reason, S.M. Goenka, one of the most famous Vipassana masters, once stated Personal Communication, 1984, that the image is seen in itself, and the sound is heard in itself. The different qualities of consciousness and its levels are explained by synergistic theory as associated with discrete strata of organization of the lattice. These synergic bands also correspond to discrete neurosynthetic strata of the neural field. The lattice would seem to be capable of distorting along a continuum without abrupt steps. The same could be considered for the neurosynthetic nature of the neural field. That is, theoretically, there should be no synergic bands in the lattice, nor quantum levels of neurosynthetic organization of the neural field. However, all the evidence described in these chapters regarding the existence of different levels of consciousness indicates that a discrete organization must be assumed for both the lattice and the neural field. In this way, each level of consciousness would correspond to a congruent interaction between a synergic band and a neural field, with a neurosynergic level analogous to the synergy of the corresponding band of the lattice. Just as each point of the lattice contains the whole, so each experience is an experience of the whole for the whole itself. The fact that we don't understand this depends on our level of understanding and the identity we assume. Experiencing a visual image as seen in itself requires a difficult to achieve awareness. It's more likely to assume a concrete identity and consider it the center of perception, since this is more in keeping with common sense, which presents us with separate and independent centers of existence, such as objects or organic bodies. Each sensory quality is a level of consciousness and corresponds to a particular synergic band, in congruent interaction with a neural field of a specific neurosynergy. The latter is determined, in part, by the informational density of the neural field, which in turn depends on the number of neuronal interactions. This is determined by the duration of brain processing. So, associated with neurosynergy, we find functioning within a specific duration of the present. I had already mentioned that the expansion of the duration of the present determines a defined temporal perception, in which a series of events occurring at different times are unified. Temporal unification is a transformation of space into time, and can therefore be conceived as a penetration into four-dimensionality. Thus, each level of consciousness could be conceived as functioning in four-dimensionality, or as penetrating it. Four-dimensionality has consciousness as an attribute, so each sensory quality with a different duration of the present, and each level of consciousness also occurring in a particular duration of the present, could be conceived as different strata of penetration into the four-dimensional universe, until at the limit of maximum expansion of the duration of the present, what exists is the pure four-dimensionality of the lattice in pure consciousness. Chapter 5. Flowing in the Selflessness, about the experience resulting from the temporary loss of the ego. Introduction. This chapter begins with a poem, and then continues with a series of reflections that attempt to share the experiences that result from the temporary loss of self. The term "the" refers to reality with a capital letter, which Buddhism defines as the pure self, distinct from the ordinary reality of the world of objects. Therefore, flowing in the self without self refers to the reality of the pure self, transcending the ego and object reality. Flow in the without self. It is the fear of death, the cause of death, for not living in pure existence, unstructured of the one who has left everything to give oneself entirely in every reborn moment to the mystery of the beloved. In the absence of the known, the body cries out by repeated experience very similar, but at least familiar, that gives presence to his authority. But when he lets go of the moorings upon regaining faith, realize that the identity gained real treasure is only in the intimate moment when catapult was to discard the previous mask. In reality, without me leaving behind what I thought I was. Name, history and past fresh life appears no longer tied, free from jail, bolt and part. Then fill the vision what it is. The image sees itself perfection in everything, all new, nothing known, except knowledge. That's how it is. From miracle to miracle of the flower, the charm of breathing, light of the movement, the whole of the sun, the infinite that is no identity restricted without attachment to what is known. There he recovers, the one to his beloved son, guides him, blooms. Nothing has changed, only the veil has been ripped. The same light in all, but now without blockages in each one, a different approach of that which is. Previously forgotten, sheltered by fear in what it is supposed to be. Now mortally wounded without support crutches, clogging filters, neo in love. Everything is illuminated without fear. Wisdom is the liberation from ignorance, so that we can flow in him without self. Ignorance is very strange and more complex than wisdom. The latter is simple and natural. Ignorance, on the other hand, is labyrinthine, full of twists and turns and dead ends. When someone lacks wisdom, they speak and become confused, wandering among illusions that last only a short time and ultimately plunge them into confusion and fear. Wisdom is contact with the unnameable, with that which cannot be defined or explained. It fills and does not confuse. It is self-sufficient in its splendor. It is self-effulgent and endless. Ignorance is madness. Wisdom is beyond madness. It includes and surpasses it. From wisdom, ignorance in its madness appears abysmal and dark. Wisdom is human and loving. Ignorance is cruel and selfish. Wisdom is open and permanent. Ignorance is personal and hidden. Wisdom is freedom and independence. Ignorance is prison like slavery and dependence. The wise man is patient and humble. The ignorant man is arrogant and incapable of waiting. The wise man finds reasons to be happy with everything. The ignorant man is satisfied with nothing. For the wise man, nature answers and guides, but he knows himself to be beyond it. The ignorant man despises life and its contingencies, but is incapable of transcending them. Wisdom is sweet and tender. Ignorance is bitter and abrupt. To liberate oneself is to step outside the self, to leave it behind and flow into him. In this state, one heals and is healed. Wisdom appears, and ignorance dissolves into its own juice. Faith is recovered, and power is regained. Everything responds, and everything is lived in fullness and mystery. Enlightened ignorance is the name of this blessed state, in which everything is as new as vision for a newborn baby. Freshness in everything, and silence filled with light within. There is no longer any judging or accepting of being judged. Lack of faith is the cause of depression. Questions offer no meaning, and every answer is based on the absence of meaning. Love, on the other hand, is based on faith, because like faith, love is a surrender to the mystery, trusting in him. Flowing in him without self is faith and love. In this flow, the self that is left behind is the personal myth, the issue of identity, or identification with any limited state or condition. One flows with the knowledge and awareness that one is flowing. Nothing binds, nothing worries, nothing confines, and one is both the flow and its container. One is equal to everything, and one with everything in a brotherhood filled with caress and familiarity. Judgments are abandoned, and theoretical interpretations nourish but do not limit. In the flow of him without self, there is neither past nor future. The eternal present is lived without expectation or judgment. All plans, desires, and longings are expressed here and now. Everything is life flowing in him. Flowing in him without self implies that he exists. If he didn't exist, flowing without self would lead to chaos. He presents himself in multiple forms. Contact with him is the point of reference from which experiencing contact with his manifestations takes on meaning. In him, meaning is total, everything makes sense. and in him is recognized the unique reality. Unique because it is not relative, unique because it is permanent, unique because it comes from oneself. Then the trials of the unresolved begin. They present themselves until they are resolved. They are resolved when he recognizes himself in them again. To resolve is to return to him. The same test isn't presented when it's resolved, and repeated when it's not. On this path, power increases to the extent that one no longer distances oneself from it. One doesn't distance oneself from it when it recognizes itself as more valuable than what tries to separate us from it. Growth in him consists of knowing how to remain in him. The trials of the unresolved arise from the unresolved. He doesn't send them as if he were separate from them. The unresolved is within us and appears when we attempt to complete a level. We don't move on to the next level until the previous one is filled. We don't advance without going backward, but only until everything is resolved. Therefore, on the path to him, everything is natural, and everything is as it should be. To flow in him without fear is to know that he is in everything, because changes are always in him. Flowing in him without self is total magic. Everything appears at the precise moment. There is no chance, and matter and objects come to life and intelligence. Everything responds and everything answers, because he is present in everything. Flowing in him without self is recovering faith in being. He is without boundaries of separation, judgment, or categories. The act and the non-act become the same. Thought and silence become the same. There is no theme or memory. Everything is new and wise in its miraculous appearing and happening. It flows from one into oneself, and there is no other because all is one. Unity in him requires the abandonment of all identity. To be in him is simply to be, without definitions or explanations. Strength lies in faith, because the secret of being is acceptance. What we experience is part of us. To live fully is to accept that we are one and unique. If what we feel does not fit our self-concept, and we struggle against what we experience, we lose our unity, we become divided, and we cease to be. By accepting everything we experience as part of our unity, we recover. But for this, faith is indispensable. Therefore, strength lies in faith, and the cure is acceptance. Without faith, there can be no acceptance, because without faith, the fear of losing ourselves overcomes us, and we prefer to maintain a mask of ourselves, to present ourselves to others and to ourselves in appearance and falsehood, in the ideal of the self and not in its reality. Faith is not in the future or the past. It is in the present and its experience. Faith is not to wait for some future event, but to live in the present with all its fullness and boldness. To have faith is to accept. By accepting, we become unified, because we are no longer divided between what we are and what we should be. There, we simply are and flow in him without the restricted and partial self with which we identified. To flow in him without self is to reach being, leaving behind the mask, the ego, and the appearance. He who is confused and, instead of flowing in him, clings to the ego makes a mistake. He is the pure self. The ego is what one believes oneself to be in appearance. He has no limits and is not dependent on any identity. The ego is limited and can be defined. The definition includes the ego. Change. Nothing encompasses him because all definition is included in him, surpassing it. He is love itself, and it is known by living it. He is like the light that exists only for those who can see it. He can only be known from within, although he is present in everything. There is no way to make a blind person see light by explaining its correlates or effects. There is no definition that allows a deaf person to experience sound. Light and sound can only be known by experiencing them directly. The same is true of him. He is invisible to anyone who is blind to his light and deaf to his sound. But he is neither light nor sound. He has no form or color. No texture represents him. No geometry draws him. No space confines him. For him, time and space do not exist, and in him, experience takes place in a timeless and spaceless self. To flow in him is to recognize the endless, in which sensation is without borders or termination. In him, one experiences the only thing that is truly sufficient. Waves of endless self-sufficient cognitions wash over one who flows in him. They come from nowhere recognizable, but from an inexhaustible and perpetual source. They are neither sought nor controlled, they simply appear and fill. Waves of complete happiness permeate every experience when one flows in him without self. It is an inexhaustible sea of freshness and newness, vital and luminous. There is no depression in him, nor old age. He is always new but never known. His experience guides, but it is not a path to a goal. In him, the path and the goal are one. One does not flow in him to reach him, because to flow in him is to be in him. He does not exist in a future, because he is all present. He cannot be divided, because he is one without parts. To experience him is to feel him in the utmost closeness. He occupies no place, but the place from which he is experienced is closer than one's own skin, breath, or exhalation. He is within, as the most internal, nourishing the one within. His sameness is that of all but of no one. His existence is the archetype of existence, and his presence is the mold of all presence. He is himself, beyond any self, yet sustaining all selfhood. For in him selfhood is self-effulgent and complete. Nothing feeds or nourishes him, but he supplies all who flow in him. The inspiration of goodness comes from him, because every being is his creature and child. From him all are loved, for he is the father of all feeling. In the flow of him without self, there is no judgment, but total compassion and tenderness. There is no attempt at change, nor is the act controlled. They are simply seen and accepted, with total joy for their existence. In him, we understand that everything arises from mystery, without cause or effect. Only in each act, he is a complete and self-effulgent totality. He exists beyond all existence. In him, there is no self, but being. Only without self can one experience him. The self is a filter for him, an obstacle to his experience, a veil for his light. But to remain without self, it is necessary to accept that he is also found in the self, and that the self is nourished by him. One cannot fight against the self to remain without self. The fight against the self strengthens the self. To remain without self is to accept him as the origin of the self. To be able to live without self, it is necessary to love him as the father of the self. To abandon the self, one must first accept it. Hatred of the self is a distancing from him. The self is the seed of him, and transforms into him when it takes root. Everything is included in him, body, space, and brain. To flow in him without self is to coincide in desire between that of the self and that of him. Thus, rooted, including the body, with the same desire and in action, one flows in him without self. To flow in him without self is to act in the world but not to be of the world. The self is the theme and the myth, the reference from which one judges and perceives. Reaching the myth of oneself is realizing that what one believed oneself to be was an illusion inherited from one's personal history. To surpass and transcend the personal myth is to peer into the mystery of reality without self. The self resists being discarded because, in its unconsciousness, it governs and determines vision and what is seen. To flow in the selfless is to unify what is seen with what is seen. There, the external, separated from the internal, disappears. The subject merges with the object, and the image sees itself. To flow in the selfless is to situate oneself in a place in which and from which life and death are seen as synonymous. There is no desire but desire, no attachment to any option that depends on being in the world. One could live on another planet, or on none at all in that state. Flowing in it without self is the total individuality of non-individuality. One is oneself at the level where all are one, but one lives with the experience that what happens happens to oneself, because it happens to the one lived within oneself. Here, there are no hierarchies or divisions, concepts or evaluations. Every event is total and possesses both the utmost importance and none at all. One depends on nothing and on everything. Yes and no, presence or absence, are no longer considered absolute options. One plans and does not plan, decides and does not decide, lives and dies simultaneously. Everything is loved, because in every being the whole is glimpsed. In every act, the totality of a perfect union of process and goal, part and whole, desire and non-desire, knowledge and ignorance converges. From the selfless, what others understand as custom or habit is perceived from the freshness of an ignorance of judgment illuminated by innocence. Without self, memory is recognized as transpersonal, because that is its true nature. When we remember, we do not immerse ourselves in a personal universe separate from others, but rather we resonate and tune into the collective memory and extract from it what we belongs to us. To flow in Him without self is to receive without obstructions or filters, to open oneself to the reality of the one mind and of total human memory. Thought floats and is registered without the self. When the self resides, the floating thought is confused about its origin and is thought to come from the self. The mystery is in Him, because every mystery is about the unity of which we are a part. Every unity feels mysterious, even if one belongs to it. To flow in Him without self is to experience unity as both a part and a whole. Chapter 6: Mystical Thought and Scientific Models. The levels of identity in Kabbalah and psychophysiology. We live in a time in which attempts to base mystical experiences on different scientific models have begun to proliferate, mainly of a physical nature. Remember the Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra, but also psychophysiological ones, Karl Pribram's holographic model, for example. However, no true mystic would accept such a foundation, since the paradigms of science change, while the real mystical experience is, by definition and essence, based on an absolute reality that does not change and transcends all reductionist schemes. Science attempts to explain the relationships between different events manifested in physical reality and that are capable of being measured by instruments, observed using human perceptual capacity, while the reality to which the mystic or contemplative has access is found in a prior or transcendent realm with respect to physical manifestation. A genuine mystic would accept, however, the possibility of establishing relationships between science and mysticism, as long as these are not interpreted as reductionist attempts to substantiate mysticism through science. With this caveat, I would like to present a series of relationships that can be established between Kabbalah and a psychophysiological model called the synergistic theory, which explains perception from the perspective of brain activity. The synergistic theory. This theory postulates that between the information captured by sensory receptors, the retina for example, and the appearance of a conscious percept, a visual image, there are at least 5 energetic transformations. The first of these involves the transduction of the energy contained in electromagnetic waves and photons that impact the retina into electrochemical neuronal codes. These codes, in the form of binary patterns, are transmitted to the brain through 1 million channels in each optic nerve. The second transformation occurs when the cerebral cortex is activated. This neuronal layer, made up of billions of nerve cells organized into layers, receives binary patterns from the retina and the thalamus, an intermediate structure between the retina and the cortex, and activates large populations of neurons in the different cortical layers. This three-dimensional activation creates energy fields of interaction in the cortex, which contain information in a global form. Synergistic theory refers to these fields as the neural field. The third transformation occurs when the neural field interacts with the basic structure of space, the so-called lattice of space-time. The fourth transformation occurs when the interaction between the neural field and the lattice results in a hypercomplex interference pattern. This interference pattern constitutes the energy structure of the image. The fifth transformation occurs when, through specialized circuits, the information of the activation of the neural field is reduced to neuroalgorithms, which concentrate the global characteristics of the neural fields into complex logical patterns. The interference pattern resulting from the interaction between the neural field and the lattice and its neuroalgorithmization constitute the physiological correlates of the image and its interpretation. The synergistic theory also postulates the existence of an observer capable of interacting with the interference pattern and witnessing its characteristics. On the other hand, the interaction between the neural field and the lattice has several associated and determining levels of perception, from the concrete perceptual experience, the image of a rock for example, to the most transcendent levels when unity consciousness is achieved. It will depend on the degree of coherence, the frequency, and the informational density of the neural field to determine with which corresponding level of the lattice structure a congruent and interference-free interaction is established. According to synergistic theory, congruent levels of interaction are called levels of consciousness. Therefore, the synergistic theory is a general model that aims to explain human perception in all its extent and modalities. The levels of language. Before analyzing some of the relationships between Kabbalah and synergic theory, it will be interesting for the reader to note that the same levels to which I will refer when explaining Kabbalistic thought can be found in the different meanings that almost any human verbal communication is capable of assuming. I have called these different levels of meaning first, second, third, fourth, and fifth languages. See Beyond Languages, Editorial Trillis, Mexico. I will use the simple phrase "I want an apple" to exemplify the above. I want an apple in the first language has a concrete and literal meaning, and nothing else can be deduced from it other than the manifestation of a simple desire. The person who communicates in their first language also does so from a literal and concrete level of consciousness. A sentence in their first language has no greater meaning or depth than that given to it by the speaker, and it should only be understood at that level. The same sentence "I want an apple" in the second language must be understood as possessing a more personal, idiosyncratic, and profound meaning. The phrase is used to convey not only a literal and concrete message, but also another that refers to an event, generally tinged with emotion. For example, apples were the favorite fruit of a relative who is remembered through it. Thus, "I want an apple" is making the following subtextual reference: so-and-so liked apples just like I did. Only a person familiar with the personal reference will be able to grasp the meaning of the sentence. That is, communication in a second language must be understood at the same level for communication to be adequate. In other words, those communicating must express themselves at the same level to be able to understand each other. The third level of language refers to more general, universal, and profound content than the previous levels, although it includes them. "I want an apple" in a third language can mean apples are a healthy food, capable of granting me health and well-being, as well as reminding me of so-and-so, etc. Just as in the first and second languages, the meaning referred to in the third language will only be faithfully understood by a listener functioning and resonating within the same meaning framework as the sender of the verbal communication. The fourth language is a transcendent level, in which "I want an apple" refers, for example, to the bioenergetic relationships between nature and human beings, to the ecological constants of the planet, to human beings and the plant kingdom as a unit with complex exchange dynamics, etc. Here, the speaker of the sentence is transmitting implicit, sophisticated knowledge full of biological, social, and even psychological considerations, using a simple sentence as a pretext. Establishing communication in a fourth language provides a symbolic platform for the exchange of knowledge and for connecting with something beyond the concrete. The higher the level of language, the more inclusive, powerful, and abstract the communication and its meanings will be. one could suppose the existence of a fifth language, whose level of meaning would refer to totality or unity. This fifth language would be the one implied in any communication from a true mystic, and could only be understood by a contemplative, functioning at the same level of consciousness as the former. In this case, I want an apple would be understood as a reference to the existence of life, or the desire for a creature to receive help from the Creator. The Kabbalistic levels. According to Kabbalah, the human being has the ability to function also on 5 different levels, namely 1. Alma Nefesh, 2. Spirit Ruach, 3. Pneuma Neshama, 4. Living Essence Jai, and 5. Singularity Yehida. Nefesh, the level of the soul, refers to the soul in its everyday state, common to every human being, simply by virtue of being human. Nefesh, in extension and origin, is situated within planetary existence, and could be considered the non-physical level of the psyche associated with earthly life and the body, that which is connected to the body and identified with life in the body. The Ruach spirit possesses a territory that transcends the earthly and is more closely connected to the solar system as a whole. According to Yechiel Shema, Ruach literally corresponds to or depends on the consciousness of the solar system and constitutes a bridge of connection between the soul, which is bound to the body, and to the earth. Pneuma, or Neshama, transcends even the solar system and is linked to the consciousness of the galaxy. For a human being to function at the level of Neshama, they must be pure enough to integrate into the galactic consciousness. Each level of Kabbalah brings man closer to God and to totality. In Jai, essence of the living, human consciousness is the essence of life. Jai is beyond the soul, the spirit, and the pneuma, although it includes them. A human being in Jai experiences himself as a participant, heir, and possessor of the very essence of the living. He has transcended his body, his earthly possessions, the solar system, and even the galaxy, and is closer to the totality and his creator. At the 5th level, when man becomes a singularity in Yechida, the human being transforms into a creator. His consciousness is that of the entire universe, and his identity is that of the totality. Remember to like and subscribe, perfect unity, and let the sound of the bell guide you back. Simultaneously, he is himself in a singularity without divisions or parts. The biblical dictum, I am that I am, refers to this level of singularity. The path of development from the soul to the singularity is a return to what each human being is in reality, the creator of their experience and their world. According to Kabbalah, every human being possesses portions of the soul, spirit, and living essence of the many beings that comprise them, with a series of potentialities and attributes that they must develop and manifest before reaching the singularity, where they return to themselves and become creator. A similar view is held in Buddhism. There is no external creator of the universe, rather, every human being is a creator. This development, if it occurs, implies a purification, a detachment, and an opening to perceive increasingly different levels of reality. The tendency to receive begins to reverse from the moment man reaches the level of spirit in Ruach. In Nefesh, man is incapable of giving or creating. All he knows and desires is to receive. From Ruach and onward, he begins to feel content with giving, until in the singularity he manifests himself as the absolute creator and giver. God desires not to receive but to give, and the purifying man turns to him. The levels of identity and perception. As we saw earlier, according to the psychophysiological model known as the synergistic theory, perception is a product of the interaction between the final product of brain activity, the neural field, and the information contained in space. Personal identity has as many levels as this interaction can encompass. Thus, although all human beings are capable of perceiving approximately the same realities, each individual identifies with different levels of them. Identification with a level determines, and is determined by the level of language, and the understanding of language at that level. Thus, if identity is associated with the concrete world, The first language will be the verbal tool with which that identity is communicated. On the other hand, if identity is more abstract and linked to a more transcendent perception, the third, or even the fourth, language will be its instrument of communication. The level of unity of the singularity of the self will require the use of the fifth language, in which each object, person, or event refers to the whole. From a logical point of view, assuming a correspondence between the singularity and the whole seems contradictory and paradoxical. But in the mystic's experience, both extremes form a unity. Thus, the first and fifth languages are indistinguishable from the point of view of a listener functioning in the first language, but their understanding is entirely different for someone living in the Yehida consciousness and functioning in the fifth language. When a human being knows he or she possesses an identity that includes but is not limited to his bodily existence, his personal history, his possessions, name, social position, or even his thoughts, and he recognizes himself as a living being or as pure existence, his identity expands, because he incorporates in himself the global identity of the living or the existing. At this level of identity, the self is not related to any restricted individual condition, but to the perception of oneself as existence or as life. It is not a loss of individuality, but rather an expansion of it. Both the levels of perception and identity are interrelated and connected with those of Kabbalah, as well as with the functioning of the brain. In fact, the study of brain structure is a means to understanding some of the laws common to all levels. These laws can be summarized in the following points. 1. Each level includes the previous ones. 2. Each level incorporates more information than the previous ones. 3. The higher the level of identity, the more natural its experience. 4. The higher levels are more interconnected with each other. 5. As identity expands, the feeling of love and the sense of equality and camaraderie increase. 6. Individuality is not lost as one rises from level to level, but rather expands and strengthens. 7. The feeling of self and power increases from level to level. The brain as a model. The laws of identity levels can be deduced from knowledge of how the brain works. It is not my intention here to provide an exhaustive or technical analysis of brain function, but I do want to highlight some aspects of it that relate to the levels of identity and their laws. The most important of these aspects relates to the inclusion of information and its product, neuroalgorithms. To explain the concept of a neuroalgorithm, it is first necessary to know that, in general, each element of a brain is connected to the rest through a very complicated network of interconnections. Thus, within this network there are components that receive information from many sources. In the human retina, for example, the neurons of output in the optic nerve receives information from hundreds of receptors. Circuits that concentrate information, such as those in the retina, are called convergent circuits. In a circuit of this type, there are many levels, each of which concentrates more information than the previous ones. Any code that contains concentrated information is an algorithm. A mathematical formula is an algorithm, as is deoxyribonucleic acid, the structure responsible for inheritance. The latter is also contained in the seed of a tree in algorithmic form. In the brain, the codes that concentrate information through convergent circuits are called neuroalgorithms. According to synergistic theory, identity levels are processed and associated with brain neuroalgorithms. The more powerful a neuroalgorithm is, the more information it will concentrate, and the more interconnections it will have with other elements. It will also contain greater power and unity, and in general, its greater capacity to activate the most advanced levels of identity. The neural field. But obviously, the experience of identity cannot be reduced to a neuro-algorithmic functioning. The latter, along with the brain's convergent circuits, it constitutes the anatomical physiological foundation of language, thought and logic, as well as being a model of the levels of identity, but not its factual reality. The latter is closer to the final product of brain activity, the so-called neural field. To understand the concept of a neural field, it is necessary to consider the existence of a basic structure of space. Contemporary physics speaks of this structure as a kind of network or matrix in which information is inscribed. This network, lattice, trellis, or matrix, is known as a lattice. According to synergistic theory, each activation of the brain's neurons modifies the lattice. Since neurons are interconnected, the totality of their interactions produces a complex alteration of the lattice, which is perceived as a visual image, a sound, and, in general, as the reality we are capable of experiencing. According to this same theory, identity levels are associated with modifications of the lattice brought about by neuro-algorithmic processes. The neural field is an energetic field that resonates with the lattice. This resonance has many levels of complexity, each giving rise to different perceptions and identities. Rupert Sheldrake has postulated that even memory depends on the quality and characteristics of these resonances. Identity, as a perception of oneself, would be the result of one of these resonances. For example, human identity would be the resulting effect of the interaction of all human neural fields in resonance with themselves and with the lattice of space. A plant's identity depends on the resonance its energy fields are able to establish with the genetic structure of its species. According to Sheldrake, self-remembering and the continuity of one's identity are the result of the resonance of our energy fields with our own structure. From this perspective, a mystic's identity will depend on their neural field's ability to connect with the energetic level associated with their state of consciousness, whether or not they are able to receive. In this way, Kabbalistic wisdom and physical and psychophysiological knowledge complement each other and constitute a unified experiential and conceptual body. This does not mean that science underpins mysticism, as was noted at the beginning, but both are related to each other and strengthen an understanding that pure experience does not possess. Both Kabbalah and synergistic theory accept the existence of different levels of consciousness and identity. In synergistic theory, these are associated with the strata of the spatial structure with which the neural field manages to create a congruent pattern of interaction. In other words, according to synergistic theory, experience results from the interaction between the neural field and the lattice, but this interaction is only congruent and noise-free in certain zones of interaction. These zones could be conceptualized as discrete or quantum bands or strata. Between these bands, the very interaction between the neural field and the lattice triggers an energetic process filled with noise and a lack of clarity or congruence. Therefore, in the intermediate strata between the bands, experience either does not appear or appears chaotic. Identity levels and perceptual qualities are associated with bands of congruent interaction. In Kabbalah, something similar is conceptualized. For example, Itzhak Ginsburg, a Kabbalist based in Israel, argues that Kabbalah speaks of two interacting lights as necessary to create perception. These two lights or emanations interact clearly only in certain zones or strata. When human consciousness penetrates the intermediate zones of interaction, the resulting experience is chaos. In conclusion, both synergistic theory and Kabbalah hold similar views, albeit using different language. Both affirm the existence of different levels of identity in consciousness, attempting to substantiate them with a sophisticated conceptual tool, based on mystical thought and experience on the one hand, and on scientific knowledge on the other. Neither synergistic theory is an attempt to substantiate Kabbalah, nor can Kabbalah be judged from the perspective of a particular scientific paradigm. Simply put, both disciplines are related, and seem to refer to the same existential field. Chapter 7, In Search of the Master, a Real Experience in India. In 1984, distressed by a series of personal circumstances, I decided to take a trip to India, motivated by the desire to find the peace and balance I had lost. I found a Buddhist meditation master, and for 3 weeks I practiced, under his guidance and care, the Vipassana technique at a retreat in the Rajasthan desert in northern India. During those 21 days, I continued to observe my bodily sensations and internal processes until I reached a certain degree of mastery. I could feel and witness the sensations of every part of my body, down to the smallest details. I learned to observe myself, accepting every experience without judgment or intellectual analysis. In the last few days of my practice, I had dedicated myself to scanning my memory. The constant observation of my bodily sensations had increased the strength of my concentration and purified me. I scanned my body and, at the same time, asked myself the most unlikely questions. What had I done on the morning of October 8, 1962? Or, what did I dream on the night of December 10, 1952, between 2 and 4 in the morning? All I had to do was pose the questions, and the answers would appear in my mind with astonishing accuracy, and a wealth of detail that never ceased to impress me. I had no doubt about the veracity of the images I recalled, nor about their coincidence with the dates and even the times of the events. I could recall everything from the colors, the clothes and surroundings, and even the texts of the books I was reading on a given date. The meditation process had succeeded in opening up all access to my memory archives, and I was able to confirm within myself that nothing we experience, learn, say, or read is ever lost. Everything is there, waiting to be recalled. Memory is complete. The difficulty lies in its retrieval, not its storage. Of course, the same memory could be evoked from different angles. For example, I could see myself as a child, at school, from different areas of the classroom. This meant that the archive is not linear or rigid, but functional and versatile. We don't store memories as photographs, but as patterns that can be reconstructed with a certain degree of freedom. The psychoanalytic and Dianetic models, with their search for traumatic fixed memories, were wrong, and I confirmed this in myself. Yet I wasn't satisfied. I wanted more, perhaps total happiness or permanent joy. Observation taught me, but there must be another level of existence even more transcendent than the observer. I had heard of Laxman Jew, an enlightened master and custodian of the Kashmir Shaivism lineage. Laxman Jew lived in the northernmost part of India. I wrote to him, and he replied that he couldn't see me. I had heard of Sai Baba, who lived in southern India, near Bangalore. I was skeptical of him, but at the same time, I was drawn to him. In Delhi, I learned that the train ride to Bangalore took 36 hours, and that only once a week, a special train, the Bangalore Express, cut the journey time in half. However, getting a seat on the express was almost impossible and only available after booking 1 or 2 weeks in advance. It was nighttime at the station, and I asked for a ticket. In my mind, I spoke to Sai Baba and told him that if it was suitable to see him, he should send me a message. At that instant, the electric light in the entire station went out. I was astonished, but I judged it to be a coincidence. I again asked for a signal, and at that moment the light returned. I approached the ticket office. The express was leaving the next day. Something inside me told me to wait in line. When it was my turn at the ticket counter, a man came over to cancel his ticket, and they assigned it to me. It was too synchronistic. I took the ticket, and as I grabbed it, a woman behind me let out a terrible wail. I was scared, but I didn't return the ticket. Already on the train, 500 kilometers from my destination, I began to feel an invisible presence inside the car. It seemed to be someone inquiring about my life. I doubted my impression, and at that moment, a child began to cry. I felt the presence and its inquiry again. I doubted 7 times that my experience was real, and the 7 doubts were accompanied by 7 disturbances in the car. A fan would suddenly turn off, something would fall, the light would go out. I stopped doubting when events began to affect my organic body. Sudden headaches, sprains or pricking pains were the result of not believing the presence I felt. I was sure it was Sai Baba, or something associated with him searching my mind. The most painful memory of my life, my mother's illness associated with brain cancer, seemed to be the favorite event of this psychic spy, activating my memory circuits, evoking scenes from my childhood linked to my sick mother. In Bangalore, I slept in a hotel, and in the morning headed to Sai Baba's ashram. I found his followers waiting for him, seated under a large awning. They talked about their master's miracles and praised his immense power. I had already experienced some of the effects of his work, and was also awaiting his appearance. Suddenly, two simultaneous events captured my attention, one to my left, and the other to my right. I heard someone in the first direction talking about what interested me most, the caves and the places where India's greatest masters, Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, and Ramana Maharshi, had meditated. But what was happening to my right caught my attention. A young man sat passively, his face expressionless. But what was truly horrifying was his head, shaved and bearing a huge scar, most likely made by a neurosurgeon. His skull only existed on the right side. On the left, a terrifying cleft was all that remained of his left hemisphere. He practically lived with only the right half of his head, the left half being absent. I saw him in the midst of a ferocious tachycardia, and I couldn't contain a pain that rose from my intestines and nestled in my forehead. I began to cry, remembering my mother, and practically, I turned around, lost in anguish and terror. I was defenseless, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a late-model Rolls-Royce driving into the courtyard where we were standing. Inside the luxurious car was Sai Baba, who got out and began to approach us. 10 seconds before he reached us, the boy on my left tapped me on the shoulder, causing me to turn in his direction. He was blond, with long hair, a golden beard, and his clear eyes reminded me of Christ. He said, "Go to Arunchala, the mountain of perpetual radiance, in the town of Tiruvannamalai. Find Ramana Maharshi's cave and meditate on it." When he finished speaking, Sai Baba stood beside me and made a strange gesture with his arm, as if he had wanted to pick up something that was around my body. After that movement, he walked away and I stood still. I searched my insides and felt empty. There was a kind of hollow that used to be my soul, but now there was nothing. The sensation was like having been robbed, raped, or sucked dry. I almost crawled away. Meanwhile, Sai Baba had sat down on a chair and, like an orchestra conductor, was encouraging the people to sing. I watched his movements and noticed they are listless and bored. For 6 days I attended that darshan with Sai Baba. I still felt empty, and the only phrase that persisted in my mind was the one I had heard from the blonde bearded boy: "Go to Arunchala, to Ramana Maharshi's cave." Something, however, began to fill my emptiness. It was a strange joy that was not mine, a kind of substitute for my own being, luminous but not mine, like the effect of an exotic drug. I liked and disliked it at the same time. Other than that, I had no desire to do anything, think, talk, or even walk. Only that feeling, the thought of Arunchala, and the need to see Sai Baba persisted within me. On the 7th day, something told me I had to go. The last light in my own being was about to be extinguished, replaced by another light that wasn't mine. I struggled all morning, and in an effort that nearly made me faint, I bought a ticket to Tiruvannamalai and boarded a hot, packed truck, after resting in a park, lying on the grass. The truck started moving and I, empty and thoughtless, leaned over the side, clutching my seat. Suddenly, the feeling of emptiness changed completely, with no thought or time intervening between it and the previous state of apathy and listlessness. It was like a sudden burst of energy. I looked for what or who had caused it, and when I looked out the truck window, I saw a white Mercedes-Benz drive by with Sai Baba inside. Once or twice a year, I traveled to Bombay, and the sudden emotional shift and vitality associated with its proximity astounded me. 10 seconds later, I was back to my emptiness and apathy. At 4 in the morning, I took a rickshaw from Tiruvannamalai. The driver of the bicycle which pulled my small seat headed to Ramana Maharshi's ashram and dropped me off at its entrance. I practically collapsed on the stairs and tried to sleep without success. At 7 in the morning, I tried yoga and managed 2 or 3 postures that gave me some energy back. At 10 in the morning, after a 2-hour climb, I reached Ramana Maharshi's cave. He had been meditating inside for more than 20 years. Its caretaker, a thin, serene, and completely naked Hindu, except for a small loincloth, invited me in after offering me a flower-shaped fruit with a texture and color similar to tiger fur. I stayed inside the cave meditating, observing my body with my mind's eye, feeling its sensations, and after several hours, I began to feel a vitality, wholeness, and joy, at first faint and then more intense, filling my interior. It was no longer like a drug or a substitute for myself that inhabited me, but rather it was myself, whole and distinct. I remained in the ashram for 3 days, meditating continuously, and walking around the mountain of perpetual radiance. The mountain and its name were synonymous. At night, that gigantic mass literally glowed as if lit from within. I felt the same way, and I promised myself never to look outside or to any human being for what I should find within myself. On the 3rd day, I began to live in pure existence. There was no history or past in me. There was no name or profession in me. There was no country or city that was my own. All that existed was existence, and I was in it and like it. It was a kind of inner emptiness, but inhabited by the light of life, with no owner. It was not the emptiness I had felt with Sai Baba, occupied by another self, but the luminous emptiness of myself as an existence equal to any other existence, but at the same time unique and shared with no one. It was me and myself, in the absence of ego and concrete identity. I thanked God for having been able to rescue my soul and said goodbye to Ramana Maharshi's ashram. I remember all this now that I'm writing this 6 years after it happened. I learned a lot from that experience, and I share it with the hope that those who read it will also learn something from it. Chapter 8. Enlightenment in the Light of Different Spiritual Traditions, Reality and Realities. Virtually all spiritual traditions agree in affirming the existence of a sublime state, which is known as enlightenment. This state occurs as a result of an establishment in reality. Since there is much confusion regarding the term reality, I will begin this chapter with an attempt to clarify it. Reality is generally considered to be what we see, the external world filled with objects and living beings. Certainly no one can deny that what our senses present to us is reality. But for it to become reality, there should be no intermediary between it and us. What we perceive is the final result of a very complex process, in which memories, conditioning, and interpretations intervene in its creation. The world itself, as it is filtered as if it were a screen that colors and shades it. This screen is inside us, and is invisible to us, and therefore we are unaware of how it operates. The very fact of perceiving a world external to us is the product of a distortion created by the existence of this perceptual screen and its filters. We begin our existence as being, without recognizing ourselves as either separate or united, within an environment that appears as amorphous as our own body. Through an arduous process of experimentation, we recognize that there are enormous differences in the sensations our body gives us when we bite it, suck it, damage it, etc., compared to the sensations produced when we touch other bodies or objects. Little by little, we acquire a bodily identity that solidifies and structures itself in consciousness as an object separate and independent from all other objects. Our entire body stores impressions and memorizes them on its surface and within. Pleasurable events are recorded and, when evoked, provoke approximation and attachment reactions. Painful experiences are recorded and provoke rejection reactions. Depending on the quantity of these, their intensity and quality, the self and the objects of the world are nuanced with the same qualities as those stored in memory. The world remains the same, but its perception will depend on the vividness and reactivity of the memories stored in our body, and thus will it be seen. Through this mechanism, realities emerge, which are confused with reality. The latter, to be perceived, would need to be perceived without intermediaries, without memories or conditioning. After the acquisition of bodily identity, other identities emerge, each resulting from the solidification of a set of related events. In fact, a level of self-identity emerges as a result of a process very similar to that which stimulates the perception of a solid object. Both result from the identification of a pattern and the activation of a brain neuro-algorithm. The latter represents the structure derived from the set of related events. The object is truly a process, but it is perceived as a solid object as a result of its algorithmicization, solidification, and the perception of separateness and independence are perceptions of the internal algorithm, not of the external object. The latter is a package of atomic and molecular motions interrelated with each other, and with all the energy fields existing in space. Identity, at any level, is also a process of interrelated events that solidify in internal perception and acquire separateness and independence. Subsequent levels of identity, starting with the body, result from a scheme of internalization of norms, values, prohibitions, and social frameworks. Certain spontaneous responses in a child are rewarded, while others are punished. The parent's perspective, their own identity reference, is passed on to the child, and little by little, determines a similar identity to what is considered adequate. The expansion of the child's identity will depend on the development of their mentors and the awareness of their parents and family members. I don't have enough space to explain in detail the possible levels of identity that can be internalized, but suffice it to say that in all of them, there is a boundary between what one believes oneself to be and what belongs to non-being. The surface of separation between these two beliefs is the boundary of personal identity. The reality of oneself is confused with the reality of what one believes oneself to be, just as the reality of the world is confused with the reality of one's perception of it. The truth is that there is a reality in which there is no separation between what one is and the world. The experience of this reality is enlightenment, the structure of reality and its experience. A good model of reality and its structure is derived from an analysis of the organization of space. In space, each point concentrates information about the entirety. Everything that happens in the universe is reflected in changes that occur in any and all of its portions. The organization of information in space is holographic, not only for the aforementioned reason, but also because everything in it is interconnected and nothing is independent. On the contrary, a structure of mutual interdependence, non-separateness, and mutual interconnection forms the spatial framework in which all knowledge is inscribed. What happens in this place reverberates and affects all areas of space, and what happens in all points of the universe is represented here. Our brain records all these changes, however subtle, but our consciousness only detects those that rise above the noise of the system. In turn, the noise of the system is determined by the unprocessed memories that exist in the body, by the filters of reality and their intermediary screens. If this noise were to decrease, we would be aware of what is happening throughout the universe, because we naturally register it. The structure of reality is entirely similar to the structure of space. Each level of ego identity contains the seed of reality. From the indefinable sense of being in the newborn, to the experience associated with bodily identity in the child, and all subsequent levels of identity, reality is present, but limited by some solidified structure. In other words, what I feel as myself contains the experience of reality, and this is present throughout the entire scale of my development up to enlightenment itself. The difference is that, in enlightenment, my identity is reality itself, without filters or separations, whereas before, reality itself was experienced as a self, but in a limited and distorted form. The taste of enlightenment. Since reality is holographic, its flavor is found in each of the strata of the self. The self from which we observe the world is the same self from which the world observes itself. To experience the fact that the image sees itself and the sound hears itself is to be situated in the reality of enlightenment, and there the taste of it is complete. In all other identities, the experience of the self also contains the taste of the image, of enlightenment, but to a lesser degree and with erroneous cognition. The understanding that there is no observer independent of the observed, and that there is something beyond any dichotomy, is only achieved when all solidifications of all identities have been discarded. This in turn occurs as a result of the cleansing and elaboration of memory and the consequent perception of nothing as an independent, absolutely existing object. In reality, nothing exists except it, because the solidity of everything has disappeared. This disappearance occurs when it is clearly perceived that solidification was only an adaptive and necessary mechanism to avoid being admitted to a Western psychiatric hospital. Identity without solidification is the identity of a self without separations, matter and consciousness. One of the most difficult cognitive legacies to discard is the one that affirms the existence of matter. The basic structure of space is considered inanimate, even though it is assigned the capacity to create all possible forms. The latter, as distortions of an inanimate structure, are also classified as inanimate. Far from our conceptions is the primary idea that even the very structure of space is consciousness. If we were to assume this consideration, we would have to accept that everything that exists are different levels of complexity of the same consciousness. From this point of view, human existence and that of an elementary particle share the same substratum. Also from this point of view, a statement as reckless as the image sees itself acquires complete meaning. If this is so, the focal points of identity are superfluous, and the sensation of possessing ego independence is nothing more than an illusion derived from the solidification process. According to this, I am the one who perceives a reality separate from me, and if I were to cease to exist, the perceived reality would also cease to exist. The truth is that I can never cease to exist, simply because I have never existed and never will. The illusion of separate existence falls apart in the reality of enlightenment, because there it is understood that there was never birth and there will never be death. Let us now hear what the enlightened ones of the different traditions have said about their experience of reality. In enlightenment, individuality is not lost but expands, and each realized being enriches reality. At the same time, from reading what follows, it will be more than obvious that the experience of reality is one and does not differ from tradition to tradition. The experience of enlightenment in different spiritual traditions. Zen Buddhism. Zen, as we know it today, originated in China when Bodhidharma, the 280th patriarch from the Buddha of our era, introduced Buddhism to China from India. Zen never existed in India because the Hindu spirit, unlike that of China, is too metaphysical and removed from practical life. However, Zen is believed to have appeared one Hindu evening when Buddha was preaching to a congregation of his disciples on Holy Vulture Mountain. He did not speak because he wished to directly convey the doctrine of enlightenment, and this cannot be explained in words. He simply held up a bouquet of flowers before the assembly, a bouquet that someone had offered him. No one understood the message except for Mahakasyapa, an old and noble disciple who smiled silently. The Buddha understood that Mahakasyapa had fully grasped the meaning of enlightenment and proclaimed, "I have the most precious treasure, spiritual and transcendental, which I give you at this moment, O Venerable Mahakasyapa." Mahakasyapa was the second patriarch after Sakyamuni himself, and the only one who grasped the doctrine of enlightenment. Buddha knew that his integral realization would not be understood and never attempted to fully explain it. He developed a series of moral and doctrinal precepts that are often confused with true Buddhism, forgetting that it is rooted in the direct experience of enlightenment. Zen prides itself on being the only branch of Buddhism capable of stimulating enlightenment, and that bases its teaching on it. Of the Buddha who preceded Sakyamuni, it is said that before the Buddha of this age, there were 6 more Buddhas. We remember the following: pure and immaculate is the nature of all sentient beings. From the very beginning there is no birth nor death. This body, this mind, are a ghostly creation, and in the ghostly transformation there are no sins or merits. Kasyapa. Cited by D.T. Suzuki in Essays on Zen Buddhism, Kia, Buenos Aires, 1981. This body, this mind, are phantasmal creations, seems to refer to the illusory solidification of processes, to the confusion that sees absolute existences in what is neither absolute nor independent. The 6th patriarch, from the Buddha of this age, said, "Penetrate into the ultimate truth of the mind, and you will have neither things nor non-things, enlightened and unenlightened are the same. There is no mind nor thing." Dritaka, Ibid. To penetrate the ultimate truth of the mind is to reach the real nature of the self. There, reified structures do not exist. Nothing exists except reality. In reality, one understands that everything is enlightened, and that the enlightened and the unenlightened are the same. Everything in Zen is paradoxical to the logical mind. But in enlightenment, the paradox ceases to be so, because a communion is established with the only thing that truly exists and is not illusory. About my own update these days, it is truly creative and destructive. I play with miraculous transformations, penetrating all circumstances, and wherever I am, I have nothing left to seek. Circumstances are no longer capable of changing me. If students come looking for me, I go out to see them. They don't see me. So, I dress in all kinds of clothes. The students immediately begin to speculate about them, taking them as my words. This is all very sad. Blind, shaven-headed men without eyes depend on the garments I wear, green, yellow, red, or plain. When I take them off and put on only the garments of purity, the students see a reflection and gather together in joy. And when I undress, they are disappointed, and in surprise, they run away in fear and complain about my nakedness. So I say to them, "Do they really know me, the one dressed in all these garments?" And suddenly they turn their heads and recognize me. Rinzai Gigan. Once, a great scholar came to speak with a Zen master, and the latter invited him to tea. He began to pour the liquid into a cup until it was full, but he continued pouring. The scholar, astonished, shouted at him, "Don't you see it's already full and overflowing?" "That's right," the master told him. "It no longer has room for anything. It's like your mind, too full to fit anything in. To understand Zen, you must first empty yourself." The content of enlightenment cannot be predicted from intellectual analysis. In Zen, a transcendence of linear logic must first occur in order to gain access to enlightenment. Judaism. In Judaism, God cannot be represented in any known form. He has no color, shape, or texture. He is neither a voice nor an image, and any rational concept of his existence is incapable of explaining him. God is total enlightenment, without time or space, and anyone who wishes to be enlightened must approach his magnificence by wanting nothing for themselves. Jewish Kabbalah is an attempt to understand divine laws, a true science of ecstasy that transfers into human language the experiences of the great Jewish mystics in their attempts to approach God. Jewish Hasidism is the experience of enlightenment in life. It is characterized by joy and the joy of living, understanding that God is found in everything, and that man's mission on earth is to rescue consciousness from all matter. Hasidism originated with Israel Baal Shem Tov, who was born in Poland and liked to isolate himself in a forest to meditate there for weeks on end, conversing with God in the solitude of nature. The Baal Shem Tov beshed, opposed the rabbinic movement of his time, which was excessively rationalist and elitist. Millions of Jews saw in him liberation from a dry and dreary intellectualism, and the possibility of speaking directly with God without having to resort to any established authority. From the Besht onward, the Hasidim explored ways to achieve enlightenment, emphasizing the need to achieve humility and egolessness. The Besht's successor said, "But to penetrate the universe of thought, where everything is the same, you must abandon your ego and forget all your problems. You cannot reach this level if you are attached to physical and worldly things, because then you are bound to the division between good and evil, that which is included in the 7 days of creation. How then can you approach a state beyond time, in which absolute unity reigns? Furthermore, if you consider yourself as something and demand that your own needs be met, then God cannot clothe himself in you. God is infinite, and no vessel can contain him in any way, except when a person makes himself nothing." The Maggid of Mezrikah, quoted by Aryeh Kaplan in Meditation and Kabbalah, Samuel Weiser ed. York Beach, Maine, UA, 1986. In Judaism, unity is valued above all things, and God is conceived as one and only in whom everything is included. The Creator is in himself the known, the knower, and the knowledge. His knowledge does not consist in the fact that he directs his thoughts toward objects external to himself, since in understanding and knowing himself, he understands and knows everything that exists. In this way, the perfection of all creatures consists in the support that unites them with the primal source of their existence, and they fall and sink from that high and perfect position in proportion to their separation from him. Rabbi Yehuda Elashlag N., The Kabbalah, Research Center of Kabbalah Books Edition, Israel, 1984. For Judaism, enlightenment consists of approaching him, that is, reaching the unity in which the observer and the observed, the subject and the object disappear, and the image sees itself. Hinduism. In the Aphorisms on Yoga by Patanjali, this compiler described a technique that allows one to gain direct knowledge about any object. This technique is called samyama and consists of 3 steps. Suppose we wish to know a flower. The first step of samyama on the flower consists of attending to it by concentrating on it. The second step of samyama consists of maintaining concentration completely focused on the object. When this is achieved, the flower eventually occupies the practitioner's consciousness entirely, with no other content other than itself. Finally, the third step is penetrated when a fusion with the flower is achieved, and the flower is understood from within, knowing its meaning. At that moment, the flower disappears as a solid, codified object. This samadhi, in Patanjali's system, when applied to the self, results in enlightenment. Similarly, performing samadhi on reality transforms it into reality. In Hindu thought, there is talk of the existence of a fundamental or essential level that can be accessed when the fluctuations of the mind are inhibited. In the words of Patanjali, yoga is to prevent, through control, the substance or fundamental element that constitutes the mind chitta from taking various forms ritis. During that time, the time of concentration, the observer Purusha rests in his own state. Cited by Vivekananda in Raja Yoga, Kia Publishing House, Buenos Aires, 1975. Your own state is your basic, natural condition, in contact with yourself without obstructive filters. I am this refers only to the pleasure of being, that presence in the I am. If you trust me, believe me when I tell you that you are the pure vision that illuminates consciousness and its infinite content. Realize this and live accordingly. If you believe in me, then go within and ask, "What am I?" Or focus your consciousness on the I am, which is pure and simple. Discover everything you are not: body, feelings, thoughts, ideas, time, space, being, and non-being, this or that. Nothing concrete or abstract that you can point to is you. You must observe yourself continuously, particularly your mind, moment by moment, without neglecting anything. This witnessing is essential to achieve the separation of being and non-being. When the person and the observer see each other as one and go beyond, one is in the supreme state. This is not perceptible because it is what makes perception possible. It transcends being and non-being. It is neither the mirror nor the mirror image. It is what it is, the incredibly clear and strong timeless reality. Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj N. I Am That, Chaitanya, Bombay, 1984. Observation would seem to be one of the most valuable methods for achieving enlightenment, but the latter is achieved when one goes beyond the observer. The observer is one and all that is observed. It integrates and unifies the witnessing being. But awareness is only a technique, because in oneness there can be no difference between observer and observed. Taoism. The Tao that can be expressed in words is not the true Tao. With this observation, Lao Tzu warned those who attempted to explain his system using verbal logic. The Tao is something that cannot be expressed, but only experienced. It is found everywhere, always. It cannot be found when its presence is ignored, because it is always there for those who awaken to reality. For years Fan, born in Iping, searched for the Tao. To do so he isolated himself in the solitude of the mountains around Mount Omei. One morning, Fan laughed out loud. Ha 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 ha! Why didn't you tell me before? I haven't found the Tao, but I've suddenly realized that I had never lost it. Those crimson clouds of dawn, that brilliant light at noon, the course of the seasons, the melting and evaporating of the moon, all these are not majestic functions or auspicious symbols of what lies behind. They are the Tao. To be born, to breathe, to eat, to reread, to walk, to sit, to wake, to sleep, to live, to die. To do all these is to follow the Tao. When you learn to take things as they come, without worrying about thoughts of joy and sorrow, letting yourself go without thinking of wishing anything were other than it is, then you are one with the mists of the valley, the floating clouds. You have attained the Tao. You have been reborn immortal. It is a joke to spend years searching for what was never lost. Cited by John Blofeld in Taoism, Martinez Roca, Spain, 1981. Again we find unity as the supreme state, synonymous with enlightenment. This perception will lead you face to face with the true secret cherished by all accomplished sages. The mind of one who returns to the source thereby becomes the source. Your own mind is destined to become the universe itself. Seng. Cited by John Blofeld in Taoism, Martinez Roca, Spain, 1981. Christianity. Jesus' 40 days of fasting and his rejection of material goods and worldly powers indicate that his identity was not tied to his body or its satisfactions. The way he handled his physical pain while preserving his love for his neighbor indicates that his conscience was situated in reality. He was free from established authority, thereby demonstrating his detachment from collective identity. Having established himself in reality, all his references to himself were not personal, but rather related to the state of realization and consciousness he had achieved. Only in this way can we understand some of his statements. If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and follow me. Lucas 9:23. That is, if someone wants to approach enlightenment, he must disidentify himself from his limited identity. In unity consciousness, the bodily limits include the environment, hence, feats of power can be performed. The miracles attributed to Jesus can be explained as a result of his being grounded in his true nature, which is the same for everyone and everything. In reality, what one experiences is not separate from what others experience. One is the Son of Man because all human possibilities are included within one's own identity. Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. Lucas 9:48. In my name, it means in my state of consciousness, in which the child and I are one and the same. Disidentification implies innocence and lack of judgment, perception of the obvious, and spontaneity. There is no ego or preconceptions. One is like a child. I praise you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Lucas 10:1. The wise and knowledgeable are those who use linear and rational logic, and reality can never be appreciated in this way. Reality is found in everything, and everything exudes its beauty and magnificence. Consider the lilies, how they grow, they toil not, they spin not. Yet I say unto you, that not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed like one of these. Lucas 12:2-7. In reality there is no chance, and everything is as it should be. But to perceive this, one must live in the present. The kingdom of God will not come with observation, nor will they say, Lo, here it is, or Lo, there it is. For behold, the kingdom of God is within us. Lucas 17:20-21. Mexican shamanism. Omniscience is one of the most appreciated qualities in Mexican shamanism. Don Panchito from Tixhualactan possessed it to an extraordinary degree. Everything that happened within his mind, and he observed it. The appearance of a sound was perceived by him, step by step, and nothing existed outside. The barking of a dog was constructed in one area of his mind, and nuanced in another, until it became recognizable, but neither dog nor bark existed in an outside separate from his own mind. Since everything happened within him, there were no distances for his consciousness. He knew what his disciples were doing, saying, and experiencing as if it were happening to him. Pachita's surgical exploits, in which organ materialization and transplantation were part of her daily life, cannot be explained unless we consider that this Nahuala shaman was located in the unit and that her body encompassed those of her patients. In the organic body, an order to move an arm is followed by the act in a natural concatenation. When the body expands, things obey orders, because they have ceased to be things and become parts of the body itself. For Don Juan Matus, perception is explained as a result of the alignment of two bands of conscious emanations, commanded by an assembly point. Enlightenment occurs when the shaman is able to simultaneously align all the bands, maintaining the consciousness of being throughout this expansion. Aligning all the bands implies achieving the unity of all possible realities. Don Rodolfo, from Jalapa, affirms that the true shaman is the one who has managed to love everyone as himself, making no distinction in his work of helping and healing others. Don Lucio, from Morelos, managed to establish contact with a level of reality where all are brothers and sisters, in the absence of jealousy, envy, or competition. Based on his experience, anyone in need of his help receives it, even when it means personal sacrifice. The shaman is open to experiencing non-ordinary levels of reality and serving as a bridge between them and everyday reality. Therefore, he is an expert at penetrating states of ecstasy, from which he draws his wisdom. Sufism. The mystics of Islam are lovers of love. They believe that the heart is the center of life, and from there, in love for everything, one can experience reality. The seeker is the meditation technique that Sufis use. In it, the following statement is made: Allah ilaha illallahu, there is no God except God. God is the reality and nothing exists outside of him. The Sufi loves God above all things, and through that love achieves unification. His love entered and removed everything except him, leaving no trace of anything else. In this way he became one, just as he is one. They are Azids quoted by R. Nicholson in The Mystics of Islam, Routledge and Keegan, London 1966. The Sufi's longing is to draw closer to God, the beloved, and to be one with him. Feeling united with God for a moment is better than all human acts of devotion from the beginning to the end of the world. Shibli Ibid. Jalaluddin Rumi proclaimed that the soul's love for God is God's love for the soul, and that by loving the soul, God loves himself. In my heart you dwell, in my eye you shine, just to be one with you my soul desires. Conclusions. Reality is one, the same as thee. Abu Sa'id Ibid. Enlightenment And although each spiritual tradition refers to the supreme state using different terminology, mind in Buddhism, God in Judaism, Tao in Taoism, they all speak of the same thing. In enlightenment, individuality is not lost, but rather expands. Every being who has attained enlightenment remains themselves, and reality manifests within them in their own form, enriching it with their own being. Enlightenment is not a complete emptiness, but it requires reaching the emptiness of all filters and conditioning to experience it. In it, love and compassion permeate every action. Enlightenment doesn't imply abandoning life or the body either. On the contrary, reality is pure, vibrant life, replete with experiences and content. In enlightenment, one is in the world, but not of the world. One is there to share and collaborate, because in enlightenment, the only motivation toward others is to help them achieve it. May we all be enlightened in this life and reach reality. Chapter 9. The Buddhist Doctrine of Void in the Light of Contemporary Psychophysiology. For Buddhists, understanding the void is an indispensable requirement for achieving enlightenment. Enlightenment occurs when the seeker comes into contact with reality as it is and recognizes its true nature. The doctrine of emptiness states that nothing exists absolutely, independently, and permanently, and that the difficulty in freeing oneself from the bonds of conditioned life lies in ignorance about reality and confusion with the illusion we have of it. In other words, when we perceive, we see the world as made up of objects that appear to be separate and independent of one another. When we see ourselves, we do so in a similar way. We consider ourselves to possess an independently existing, permanent, and absolute self. In the same way that we reify objects, we solidify ourselves, and this erroneous perception is the cause of our remaining in a state of unfreedom and lack of wisdom. Instead, if we recognize that both objects and ourself appear absolute because we perceive them that way, not because they are, we would be liberated. Achieving emptiness and its perception consists of removing the veils and errors of perception, both from the environment and from oneself. Emptiness refers to the absence of filters on perception, which allows us to see reality as it is. The reality is that everything is interdependent, changes from moment to moment, and nothing has absolute existence. From the perspective of reality, there is nothing to cling to, and therefore, nothing that can cause suffering. The latter occurs as a consequence of our attachments, and these occur as a result of the consideration of loss. We suffer when we feel that our self is in danger of being damaged or destroyed, because we consider ourself to have inherent existence and be subject to death. The absence of suffering results from the absence of attachment, and this is a consequence of non-existence. In other words, by recognizing that our self does not possess absolute existence, there is no fear of losing it, since what does not exist is not susceptible to being lost. The doctrine of emptiness brings liberation precisely for the reason mentioned above. Knowing that everything is void of absolute existence, that everything changes, and that everything is interdependent, there can be no attachment, no fear of destruction, and no death, since that which has never been born cannot die. If the doctrine of emptiness is true, our psychophysiological functioning must be congruent with it. In this chapter, I will review contemporary psychophysiological knowledge, in order to analyze to what extent what we know about the psychophysiology of perception supports or contradicts the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, the structure of space. In order to understand the psychophysiology of perception, it is necessary to analyze the way in which information is organized in space. Therefore, I will begin my discussion with the description of the structure of space. From the perspective of modern physics, what we call space possesses varying degrees of organization, from a level of empty space to a space filled with objects. The basic or fundamental level of space is a colossally complex matrix of total coherence and symmetry. This matrix is a kind of lattice or trellis, in which each of its points concentrates the information of the rest. In such a space, neither objects nor particles exist, time does not pass, and there is no gravitational force. This level of space is called the lattice of space-time. A next level of space involves a distortion of the lattice. When this occurs, an area of the lattice loses coherence and suffers a microbending. A physical instrument detects this distortion as an elementary particle. There are families of similar distortions, and therefore defined categories of particles. What we call a material object is an interrelated set of microdistortions of the lattice. The level of organization of space filled with objects is a level at which the lattice is distorted in all its portions. The term distortion is not pejorative, but merely descriptive, and should be interpreted as such. The lattice is a type of superconductor in which any of its distortions are represented in each and every one of its points. The level of the lattice in the absence of distortions is an abstraction, but a space that approximates it is interstellar space, far from any object. In that space, the lattice approaches its level of maximum coherence and symmetry. Let us call this pole of spatial organization the pole of high synergy. 1. In contrast, the pole of space organization, in which the lattice is distorted and material objects exist, possesses minimal coherence and low symmetry. Let us call this pole the pole of low synergy. The term synergy is a neologism, derived from the terms synthesis and energy. The greater the synergy, the greater the coherence and symmetry. The lower the synergy, the more time passes, and there are no material objects or gravitational forces, whereas in a low synergy space, matter exists. Time passes, and gravitational forces exist. The lattice brain analysis. When our retinal receptors interact with information located in space, they transform the distortions of the lattice into neuroelectrical signals that are encoded in the form of patterns. The type of patterns that are triggered will depend on the characteristics of the distortions. These patterns are true algorithmic formulas too, which penetrate the brain through millions of nerve channels. Inside the brain, and especially in the cerebral cortex, these patterns are concentrated by convergence circuits. An algorithm is a mathematical formula or pattern that gathers information and represents it in symbolic form. The human retina is a good example of a convergent structure. The first retinal layer is composed of several 100 million receptors, while the last retinal layer only has 1 million neurons. The information from several hundred receptors is concentrated in a single fiber, and a neuroelectrical pattern appears within it, a highly powerful algorithm. In other words, the structure of retinal circuits is convergent, and each output fiber of this structure concentrates information coming from a large population, several hundred of receptors. The algorithmic output pattern contains, in a logical structure, the concentrated information that, prior to its activation, was dispersed. In the cerebral cortex, the processes of information concentration and neuroalgorithmization increase in power, such that a small population of nerve cells concentrates the information of billions of neurons into a neuroalgorithmic pattern. Through this functional procedure, information is unified. The perception of objects. When a distorted area of the lattice is encoded by the brain, it activates neuroalgorithmic patterns, which concentrate information in its structure and unify it. We see an object as a solid, independent and separate from the others, because what we truly perceive is the unified internal neuroalgorithm and not the distortion of the lattice. In the process of neuroalgorithmization, not only information from the distortions of the lattice intervenes, but also our memories and past experiences. In other words, every neuroalgorithm is a mixture of information from the lattice, combined with internal information. When we see an object, we see all this information concentrated and mixed within it. From this perspective, the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness is entirely congruent with the psychophysiological way in which perception functions. Only a neuro-algorithmic functioning free of memories and add-ons would give us a vision of reality as it really is. An object appears as a solid because in our perception we transform the neuro-algorithmic unit into a solid thing. The neuro-algorithmization of the self. Exactly the same thing happens with our perception of ourselves. It can be conjectured that, just as with the neuro-algorithmic unification of an object, in which millions of cellular activations are concentrated in a convergent pattern, the self emerges from a unified concentration of all the brain's information. In other words, one can assume the existence of a final neuro-algorithm, which represents the activity of the entire brain system, and concentrates it into a highly powerful algorithmic pattern. This neuro-algorithmic unification would be perceived as the self, with all the characteristics of independence, separateness, and absoluteness that we assign to any material object. In this way, the self is also perceived as an unchanging and absolute thing. The neuro-algorithm of maximum power concentrates, in its logical structure, the information of the entire system, with all its memories, conditioning, traumas, and past associations. The liberation. From a Buddhist perspective, liberation occurs when we discover that ego solidity and object solidity are false. That is, that there is no absolute and unchanging self, just as there are no objects with absolute existence. This liberation occurs when memories are purified, and reality is not confused with a distorted interpretation of it. From a psychophysiological perspective, the above process occurs when the converging chains responsible for neuro-algorithmization are purified and neuro-algorithmic solidity is dismembered. In this condition, the absolute and fixed solid character of the self and objects disappears, and in its place, reality appears as it is, a continuous and changing flow in which misinterpretations cease to exist. When this happens, the coherence of the brain system increases, as does its symmetry. This is equivalent to a space of high synergy. In contrast, when neuro-algorithmic fixity exists, there is no fluidity, and everything is perceived as reified. This is equivalent to a space of low synergy, the neural field. Each activation of the brain's neurons evokes a micro-distortion of the lattice of space. The combination of all these micro-distortions activates a hyper-complex macro-distortion of the lattice. Contemporary psychophysiology calls this macro-distortion the neural field. The self, therefore, is perceived as this blended and unified whole. The neural field in interaction with the lattice is perceived as the world. When brain activity is low in synergy, the resulting neural field also has a low synergy structure. A low synergy neural field is only capable of establishing congruent interaction with a level of the lattice that is also low in synergy. The world resulting from such interaction is a concrete world, full of objects and reified. In contrast, a high synergy neural field is capable of interacting congruently with a high synergy lattice level. The result of such interaction is a more subtle and abstract perception of the world, in which everything flows and there is no solidity. When a neural field has the maximum possible synergy and interacts with the basic level of the lattice, the resulting experience is enlightenment. Conclusions. The Buddhist doctrine of emptiness is entirely congruent with psychophysiological functioning. When neuro-algorithmic circuits are purified and a highly synergistic neural field is activated, perception is of reality as it is. The solidity, independence, and absolute nature of objects and the self disappear in reality, giving way to a fluid, free, and untethered vision. An object is perceived as solid when it is neuro-algorithmic. What is perceived is the internal neuro-algorithm, not the external object. Since the neuro-algorithm is saturated with memories, the world is interpreted according to them and is not seen as it is, that is, as always new, changing, and fluid. The same thing happens with the self. According to Buddhism, reality is numinous, effulgent, all bright, and we find ourselves within it when we achieve the void of all intermediaries of perception. According to psychophysiology, the lattice in its pure state is coherent, symmetrical, numinous, effulgent, and contains all the potential energy of all manifestation. We reach it when the neural field reaches levels of elevated synergy, and these are only achieved when neuroalgorithmic fixity ceases. Both approaches, the mystical and the scientific, speak of the same thing and reach similar conclusions. As for the practice that allows one to achieve emptiness and high synergy, this is the meditation in which ego identity patterns are identified, observed, and transcended, or the feedback of interhemispheric coherence, in which a subject learns to increase their cortical synergy. The first technique comes from the classical Buddhist tradition, and the second from contemporary electrophysiological psychophysiology. Chapter 10: The Electrophysiological Foundations of the Gaia Hypothesis, the Brain of Gaia. The Gaia hypothesis, according to which planet Earth is a living, conscious organism, requires experimental support. To accept Gaia as a fact, it is necessary to demonstrate that, like other organisms, its structure is made up of interconnected cellular units, forming an organized rather than amorphous structure, and that this structure is divided into strata capable of performing specific functions with a defined hierarchy. If we take the human body as an example, it is made up of a vast array of interconnected cells, forming tissues and organs, which perform specific functions within an organized and mutually dependent hierarchy. The human brain, and with it the entire nervous system, occupy the first hierarchical level, as they act as controllers of the rest of the systems. No organic system is capable of surviving in isolation and disconnection from the others, and the health of the entire organism depends on the balance between its constituent parts. Gaia as an organism must comply with these minimum organizational rules to be accepted as such, rules that identify it as a global system similar, although not necessarily identical, to any other living body. There is an evolutionary scale of complexity among living organisms. The functions that a mosquito can perform are definitely less than those capable of manifesting organisms such as an elephant or a human being. The functional complexity of an organism depends, among other things, on the number of elements that comprise it and their organization. Organic brains manifest the same correlation between their functional complexity and the number of neurons that constitute them. Gaia, as an organism, must possess a brain and a nervous system supported by a nutritional and energy-supporting structure. Gaia's brain must be made up of interconnected hyperneurons that give rise to emergent functions that are more complex than those manifested by each one separately, in the same way that the human brain manifests complex functions given by the interconnection of all its individual neurons. Each neuron in the human brain contains all the information of the unit to which it belongs, but a single neuron is not capable of manifesting the functions of that brain unit. Similarly, the brain of Gaia must be composed of individual hyperneurons capable of containing all the information of the unit to which they belong, but incapable of performing the latter's functions. I propose that the brain units of Gaia are each of the human brains that inhabit planet Earth. These hyperneurons, if the above hypothesis is true, must be interconnected, and furthermore capable of containing all the information of the unit to which they belong. In this chapter, experimental evidence is presented that leaves no room for doubt about two facts. A. There are direct interactions between human brains. B. The human brain is capable of detecting subtle events at a distance and directly. This evidence was obtained in one of the psychophysiology laboratories of the Faculty of Psychology of the National Autonomous University of Mexico by the author of this article, and by a group of researchers, among whom Manuel de la Flor and M. E. Sanchez Arellano stand out, and supports the Gaia hypothesis at the experimental level. Before presenting this electrophysiological evidence, I would like to introduce it with the following reflections. The great mystics and enlightened beings of all time have affirmed that there exists a level of consciousness in which the separations between subjects and objects disappear. This state is called unity consciousness, and is characterized by the fact that the person who experiences it expands their identity and comes into contact with a transcendent level of themselves, ranging from planetary consciousness to the great mind, the being, or the pure self. In Buddhism, for example, it is recognized that upon reaching the enlightenment of the Buddhahood, in addition to the disappearance of the object-subject dichotomy, omniscience appears, during which all events occurring on planet Earth, and even in the entire universe, are perceived in the consciousness of the person who has attained Buddhahood. These experiences suggest the existence of a global brain, with which one can interact, and which manifests more complex functions and greater knowledge than any of its elements. Whether this brain is Gaia, or even a more unified organism, of which the brain of Gaia constitutes an element, cannot be confirmed, but subjective evidence indicates that it not only exists, but that the human brain possesses the capacity to access it. The state of omniscience requires, as an indispensable condition, two conditions. 1. That the human brain is naturally capable of recording any event in the universe directly. 2. That the subject possessing such a detection instrument is able to decode the information recorded by his brain, locating it in his individual consciousness. For the second condition to be met, special training is required to achieve internal silence and a greater capacity for concentration, that is, an increase in signal and a decrease in background noise, in technical terms, an increase in the signal-to-noise ratio. The technique for achieving this is meditation. On the other hand, and in accordance with the same Buddhist tradition, not only are there direct interactions between human beings, but even the feeling of possessing an independent and absolute I is illusory and rather results from, and is based on, processes of interdependence. In the realm of science, similar considerations arise from the analysis of the now famous Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox, or ERP paradox, which was suggested in a paper signed by the three scientists whose surnames appear above, and published in an article that appeared in 1936. According to the ERP paradox, if two elementary particles interact or arise from the same radioactive process, and then separate in space, the modification of one of them is reflected in concomitant changes in the other, regardless of the distance that separates them. In 1982, a scientist at the University of Paris, Aspect, successfully conducted the experiment suggested by the ERP paradox with positive results. These results demonstrate that there is a basis for the idea that everything is interrelated, and that there is an interdependence between all particles in the universe that have previously interacted. In the psychophysiology laboratory at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, my colleagues and I began a series of studies on the so-called transferred potential in the human brain. This potential is an electrophysiological response of a brain that is not sensorially stimulated to the stimulation received by another brain with which direct communicate ion has been established. Direct communication occurs when two subjects are able to sense each other's presence, without the need for sensory signals, such as the other's image, verbalization, tactile contact, or any other physical means of communication. The stimulated subject, for example by a light, responds to the stimulus with an evoked potential, that is, a neuroelectrical response that reflects neuronal activation. The unstimulated subject also responds with a different neuronal activation, as if it had also been stimulated. Our initial experiments indicated that the morphology of the transferred potential was similar to that of the evoked potential, but it only appeared in 8% of actual stimulations. In other words, out of every 100 evoked potentials in the stimulated subject, only 8 transferred potentials could be detected. The methodology we used for this experiment consisted of the direct detection of electroencephalographic EEG activity, with clear similarities between the activity of both brains. Since the EEG is very complex, to increase the signal-to-noise ratio, we used the averaging procedure using a specially programmed computer. This procedure consists of taking samples of EEG activity from the application of the stimulus synchronized with its onset, and with a variable duration, in this case 1/4 of a second, i.e. 250 milliseconds. Each sample synchronized with the stimulus is averaged with the other samples. The portions of the samples that are repeated with each stimulus application are summed, while the random EEG activity unrelated to the stimulus, the EEG background noise, is averaged. After several averages, the result is a neuroelectrical change that reflects only what was repeated, that is, the brain's actual response to the signal, and not the noise. Using this procedure, we found the result described above, that is, 8% of potentials transferred to the stimulation of one of the subjects. To conduct the research, we first invited the subjects to sit inside a soundproof and electromagnetically shielded chamber. In conditions of complete silence and darkness, the subjects, with their eyes closed, sensed each other's presence until they were able to establish direct communication. At that point, one of the subjects was invited to enter another chamber, isolated from the first, electromagnetically shielded, and in complete darkness. The subject who had remained in the original chamber was then stimulated with a series of flashes that his partner, in the other chamber, neither received nor knew were being applied. Both subjects in the two chambers maintained direct communication throughout the entire stimulation process. Under these conditions, we recorded the potential evoked in the brain of the stimulated subject and the potential transferred to the brain of the unstimulated subject. We assumed that the condition of prior interaction was absolutely necessary to achieve the transfer. To do this, we relied on the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox, ERP paradox, which, as we saw earlier, states that if two elementary particles interact and then separate in space, the change in one leads to a concomitant change in the other, regardless of the distance between them after their interaction. The results we obtained in the transferred potential experiment indicated that the ERP paradox exists at the level of the human brain, as well as between elementary particles. In other words, as long as an interaction has been established between two human brains, just as between two elementary particles, both brains and particles remain linked, and what happens to one of them will affect the other member of the pair. From the perspective of the non-existence of chance, these results form the basis of this non-existence, since they demonstrate that objects and subjects that have previously interacted form a kind of network or matrix that unites them, and what happens to one of them will affect the other. This condition is fundamental to assuming and accepting the non-existence of chance. In a second series of experiments, we tested the prerequisite for prior interaction as an indispensable condition for establishing connections between brains. In other words, we questioned its necessity. To do so, we designed a series of experiments in which we would attempt to record the transferred potential, but from subjects who had not interacted prior to the recording. The experiment consisted of inviting one subject to sit inside a sensory and electromagnetically isolated chamber, and another subject to do the same, but in another chamber that was also shielded and sound insulated. The two subjects did not know each other, had not seen each other, and had never interacted with each other. Under these conditions, one subject was stimulated and the other was not. We recorded the EEG activity of both subjects and used the averaging procedure to detect any potential signals transferred to the brain of the unstimulated subject. Unlike the first experiment, in this one, we exaggerated the accuracy and subtlety of the averaging, first by increasing the number of average samples up to 512. An average of 512 stimulus-synchronized EEG samples increases the signal-to-noise ratio significantly. Second, we were no longer interested only in detecting the gross and apparent similarity between the two potentials, the evoked and the transferred potential, but rather in analyzing any trace, however small, of the transferred potential that might be repeated independently of its similarity to the evoked potential. To achieve this analysis, we averaged 256 samples of EEG activity in the unstimulated subject, synchronized with the onset of the stimulus in the stimulated subject. Once this average was achieved, we continued stimulating one of the subjects and averaged another 256 samples of EEG activity from the unstimulated subject. Both samples of 256 presentations were compared to each other in order to find any similarities between them. We found that these similarities exist. This result indicates that the brain of the unstimulated subject was able to detect the stimulus or brain response in its counterpart, even though the two had never established any interaction. In other words, the connection between brains exists, regardless of whether they have previously interacted. This indicates that the interbrain relationship occurs naturally and exists under conditions that do not require prior interactions or training procedures in direct communicate ion. This doesn't mean that detection has to cross the threshold of consciousness to exist. In fact, our subjects, those who showed direct brain signals of detection, were never able to tell us what was happening with their stimulated partner. This indicates that the natural connection between brains is unconscious, or at least doesn't require consciousness to exist. In terms of the absence of chance, these findings indicate that all human brains are normally intertwined and interconnected with each other, and that events detected by one brain affect the rest, without necessarily being aware of these effects. Extrapolating from this conclusion, we can say that everything detected by one brain is detected by the rest, and somehow influences the rest of the brains, modifying them. This modification, according to our results, is very subtle and only detectable using high-average procedures, that is, a methodology that substantially increases the signal-to-noise ratio. Based on the experiment described above, we decided to test the possibility that one brain could detect natural events without the need for another brain to be activated. In other words, we asked whether the non-random activity we recorded in the interbrain experiment, without prior interaction, was due to brain activation, or whether it could occur without the intervention of two brains. To this end, we devised the following experiment. A subject was invited to sit inside an electromagnetically shielded and sound-insulated chamber, while in another chamber, isolated from the first and also electromagnetically shielded, a series of flashes were presented, unobserved by any subject. To achieve this, the stimulation and averaging procedures were fully automated, allowing a computer to control the experiment without human intervention. This time, 256 flashes were presented, and the corresponding samples of the isolated subject's brain activity were averaged. Then, another 256 flashes were presented, and the brain activity synchronized with their appearance was also averaged. Both averages were compared to find any similarity that might indicate the existence of a non-random response. The response to this search was positive, that is, the unstimulated subject's brain responded to the stimulus, detecting it, even though no subject observed the stimulation maneuver or intervened in the sensory presentation. This surprising result indicates that the human brain is capable of detecting events occurring in the universe, regardless of whether they stimulate it sensorially and without the need for another brain to be activated or to have perceived the stimulus in question. The question we immediately asked was about the subtlety of this detection. In other words, the previous experiment used a flash of considerable intensity, maximum intensity on the grass photostimulator scale. Now we wonder whether the human brain is capable of detecting much milder stimuli. To answer this question, we disconnected the photoelectric stimulator and applied only a synchronization pulse to obtain the EEG sample and activate the computer's averaging program. The synchronization procedure was completely automated, so that no human operator intervened in its application. Under these conditions, the procedure of the previous experiment was repeated, inviting a subject to sit in the shielded and isolated chamber while EEG samples were taken synchronized with the synchronization pulse. I want to emphasize the fact that in this experiment, a series of high-intensity flashes were not activated, and that the only stimulus capable of being perceived by anyone was the brief and almost imperceptible light on the grass S88 stimulator, which indicated that a synchronization pulse had been activated. Aside from this indicator light and the synchronization pulse, 1 millisecond in duration and 1 volt in intensity, no other stimulus was activated. Of course, the synchronization pulse activated a computer with all its circuits, starting a complex program, and the question we asked ourselves was whether this activation could be directly recorded by a human brain. We averaged 2 series of 256 EEG samples synchronized with the aforementioned synchronization pulse and found, when comparing both averages, that there were repetitive signals in them. In other words, our results indicated that the human brain responds to subtle stimuli, detecting them directly. This result could be extrapolated to say that the human brain is capable of detecting any event, no matter how subtle. We are currently planning to repeat these experiments, but increasing the distance between the stimulus and the brain that detects it. I dare predict that we will get the same results as before, although we may need to further increase the signal-to-noise ratio to make the non-random brain response evident. These experiments demonstrate that the basis for the non-existence of chance lies in the connections between different brains, and between them and objects and events. Our results indicate that we live immersed in a network of relationships, and that the paths these relationships follow form the basis for the non-existence of chance. Finally, I would like to venture another hypothesis and present some experimental results that support and justify it. According to synergistic theory, every physical event or change results from and is a distortion of the matrix or lattice of space-time. Thus, an aroused potential or a transferred potential affects the organization of space-time and therefore could be detected in any animate or non-living system. For example, the activation of a brain could affect a crystalline organization of water, and if this alteration could be detected, it could be shown to be related to brain activation. Precisely to test this possibility, we decided to record the impedance characteristics of a liquid water impregnated with an electrolyte substance in the vicinity of a brain responding to an event. We decided to utilize and leverage the methodology described above. To do so, a subject isolated from stimuli was recorded when a flash was applied outside of conscious awareness. The impedance changes of the water were recorded next to this subject. We took samples of the subject's EEG activity synchronized with the stimulus, and, at the same time, samples of the same duration of the water's impedance changes, also synchronized with the onset of the stimulus. Both samples were averaged, and 2 averages of 256 samples each were compared. We found repetitive morphologies in both brain activity and impedance changes, indicating that both animate and inanimate systems are capable of directly interacting. We then did the same with 2 inanimate systems. To do so, we applied a series of flashes in a shielded chamber and recorded the impedance changes in the water located in another electromagnetically shielded chamber. We compared 2 samples of 256 recordings, and to date have not been able to find any repeats, indicating that an inanimate system is not capable of directly interacting with another in the absence of a brain to serve as an interface between the two. We plan to increase the signal-to-noise ratio in this experiment to investigate, to the limits of our technical capabilities, any relationship. According to the ERP paradox, such a relationship should exist, but perhaps in 2 inanimate systems, prior interaction is required. In summary, our results indicate that human brains are naturally interconnected, and that a change in one brain affects the others without prior interaction. Similarly, we found that a brain can directly affect inanimate objects, but that two inanimate systems do not affect each other unless they have previously interacted. Conclusions. We have demonstrated, experimentally, that direct interaction exists between human brains, without requiring prior contact or interaction. Strictly speaking, and if the Big Bang Theory is true, everything in the universe, including our brains, emerged from a single superparticle that exploded at the origin of time, and therefore the ERP paradox holds true in our experiments. The results we have obtained indicate that all human brains on planet Earth are interconnected and form a network of interactions, which could be the anatomical structure of the Gaia brain and the physiological and energetic foundation of planetary consciousness. On the other hand, the evidence described in this chapter indicates that everything that happens in the universe is recorded by the human brain, but is not detected in the individual consciousness due to system noise and a lack of training that increases the signal-to-noise ratio. Awareness of an event arises when the signal-to-noise ratio increases, making the event stand out from the background noise of the system. Buddhism seems to be right when it asserts that a state of omniscience exists, because such a state only requires the ability to consciously and adequately decode what the brain already registers and detects naturally. Profound insights into the nature of consciousness can be derived from our experimental results. First, it seems plausible to think that consciousness exists in everything, and that human beings either focus it on their sensations of limited identity or perceive themselves as the unity to which their brain has access. This unity has several levels, from the human corporeal level to the collective, the national, the planetary, and the universal. Each level has a body and a brain, although fundamentally all share and are sustained by the same consciousness. Second, the fact that we are all interconnected, and that each of us is capable of detecting everything that happens in the universe, indicates that we are doubly responsible for the progress of the cosmos, both because we are receptive to it to the point of being one with it, and because, by being affected by the universal order, we also affect it and participate in it, favoring its proper functioning, or in other ways, opposing it. If we are the hyperneurons of the brain of Gaia, the good consciousness of the unit to which we belong depends on each one of us. Contemporary Kabbalists affirm that the true mystery is unity. A cell in our body receives mysterious influences from the corporeal unit to which it belongs, just as each of us receives them from the brain of Gaia and her planetary body. Knowing this, let us act and think, feeding Gala with beauty and love, and that is what we will mysteriously receive and reap. Remember to like and subscribe, and let the sound of the bell guide you back.